Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the darkest winter Europe has ever known. Picture this. It's spring 1315 and rain begins to fall. Not the gentle spring showers you're used to. This is different. This rain doesn't stop. 7 weeks pass, then 8. The grain in the fields isn't ripening, it's rotting. Right there, still rooted in the ground. Can you imagine watching your entire year's food supply turn to black mush before your eyes? Now imagine you're a peasant, and you absolutely know, that if this harvest fails, you and everyone you love might not see next spring. What would you do? How would you survive? Because what I'm about to share with you tonight isn't just history. It's the story of how millions of people face something we can barely comprehend today. The complete collapse of everything that kept them alive. Now, before we step into that cold, hungry world together, I want to ask something small from you. If you find yourself drawn into this story tonight, if you feel that pull of curiosity or that whisper of, "Wait, I need to know more," would you tap that subscribe button? Maybe hit the like button if this resonates with you. I promise I'm not just collecting numbers here. Every time you engage, you're telling me these stories matter, that history told this way is worth your time. And honestly, that keeps me going. Oh, and I'm curious. Where are you right now? Tucked in bed in New York? Curled up on a couch in London? Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're joining me tonight. Now. Dim those lights if you can. Maybe let a fan hum softly in the background. Get comfortable. Because we're about to travel back 700 years to a moment when the sky itself seemed to betray humanity. The year is 1315, and nobody saw it coming. For nearly 300 years, Europe had been blessed. Historians call it the medieval warm period, a time when summers were longer, winters were gentler, and harvests were abundant enough that the population exploded. By 1300, there were more people crammed into Europe than there would be again until the 1800s. Think about that. Parts of rural France today have fewer people than they did in 1314. Villages were packed. Every scrap of land that could grow food was being farmed. The system was working. Barely. Everyone was living right up to the edge of what the land could provide. And then the rain started. Pentecost, 1315. That's mid-April for most of Europe. The rain came down in sheets. Exceedingly great rains descended from the heavens, one chronicler wrote, his hand probably shaking as he recorded what he was witnessing. In Ireland, oak trees exploded with growth that year. Tree ring data still shows the anomaly 7 centuries later. These trees were basically drowning in water. Now here's what you need to understand. Medieval farming was a knife-edge operation. You planted seeds, prayed for the right weather, and hoped. There was no backup plan, no emergency services, no government food programs. When the rain kept falling through May, then June, then July, the grain in the fields couldn't ripen. The stalks just stood there, waterlogged and useless. But it got worse. So much worse. See, without dried hay and straw, there was nothing to feed the animals through winter, and without animals there was no milk, no eggs, no labour to plough the fields for next year. The rain made it impossible to produce salt, and salt was the only way to preserve meat. You needed sun to evaporate seawater or underground brine. In wet weather? Forget it. Salt prices exploded from 30 shillings to 40 shillings almost overnight. To put that in perspective, that's like your grocery bill suddenly jumping 33% in a single month. And salt wasn't a luxury. It was survival itself. Then came the winter, and it was brutal. The cold of 1315, 1316 hit a population already weakened by hunger. But here's where the story becomes almost unbearable. Just as people were trying to recover, a mysterious plague swept through Europe's cattle. We still don't know exactly what it was, some unknown pathogen that emerged from the east. By 1319, England and Wales had lost 62% of their cattle. Some regions lost 80%, 62%. Imagine if tomorrow nearly 2/3 of America's livestock just vanished. The dairy disappeared. The labour animals died. The wealth of entire families, their only assets, rotted in the fields. And people started making choices no human should ever have to make. In Lorraine, wheat prices increased by 320%. Let me say that again. 320%. Bread became more valuable than gold for ordinary people. There's this moment that haunts me, recorded in the Chronicles, August 10th, 1315. King Edward II of England, one of the most powerful men in Europe, stopped at St. Albans Monastery with his entourage. And you know what happened? They couldn't find bread. Not for guests, not even for the King of England. The king went hungry that day. If the king can't eat, what chance did anyone else have? The social fabric started tearing. Crime rates exploded. Chronicles record murder rates climbing as desperate people fought over scraps. There are documented accounts of parents abandoning children because they couldn't feed them. Some accounts, and I want to be careful here because medieval sources loved sensational stories, but some accounts speak of cannibalism. There's this case in Scotland, recorded by chroniclers. A peasant named Christy Cleek and his wife allegedly waited in ruined buildings, ambushing travellers. The chronicles claim they survived on human flesh. Now, we should take these stories with skepticism. Medieval writers often exaggerated to make moral points. But here's what we know for certain. These stories were being written down because something had broken in society. Whether literally true or not, these tales reveal that people felt their world had descended into hell. Here's what really gets me, though. This wasn't a random disaster. This was climate change, medieval style. The warm period that had blessed Europe for 3 centuries was ending. The Little Ice Age was beginning. Between 1310 and 1330, Northern Europe experienced some of the worst sustained weather in recorded medieval history. The 1314 to 1316 period was the 5th wettest 3-year stretch in Europe from 1300 all the way to 2012. But unlike modern times when we have global supply chains and emergency food reserves, medieval people had nothing. They lived season to season, harvest to harvest. 1 bad year was manageable, 2 bad years was crisis, 3 years of failure was apocalypse. The Great Famine, as historians now call it, killed millions. We don't know the exact number, record keeping wasn't great when everyone was starving, but estimates suggest 10 to 15% of Northern Europe's population died between 1315 and 1322. That's somewhere between 7.5 and 10 million people. For comparison, that's like the entire population of New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago combined, just gone. And you want to know the cruelest irony? The harvest finally improved in 1317. The rain stopped. The sun returned. But it took until 1322 for food supplies to return to normal levels, and until 1325 for society to truly stabilize. 5 more years of hunger even after the weather improved. Why? Because they'd eaten their seed grain, they'd slaughtered their breeding animals, they'd burned through every reserve. Recovery when you've consumed your future takes a long, painful time. I think about this sometimes when we talk about climate change today. We have so many advantages medieval people didn't have. We have global trade, refrigeration, agricultural science, weather forecasting, government reserves, and still we worry, rightfully so, about what changing climate will do to our food systems. Medieval peasants had none of those protections. When the weather turned, they were utterly exposed, like standing naked in a blizzard. The Great Famine of 1315-1317 was the gunshot that started a terrible century. It weakened a generation just in time for the Black Death to arrive 30 years later. It shattered the confidence of medieval civilization. Before 1315, people believed, truly believed, that with hard work and God's blessing, things would be okay. After 1315, that faith was gone. They'd learned the hard lesson that nature doesn't care about your prayers or your plans. So as you're lying there tonight, warm under your blankets, maybe with a snack nearby if you want one, I want you to imagine, really imagine, what it would feel like to watch rain fall for weeks, knowing every drop is erasing your future, to see your children's faces grow hollow, to make calculations about who eats and who doesn't, to wonder if winter will kill you this year. Because here's what we're going to explore in the sections ahead. How did anyone survive this? What did they eat when the food ran out? How did they stay warm when fuel was scarce? What psychological tricks did they use to keep going when everything seemed hopeless? The peasants who made it through the Great Famine and the winters that followed, they weren't superheroes. They were regular people who developed extraordinary strategies for survival. And some of their techniques, they might surprise you, they might even be useful. But to understand how they survived, we first need to understand the mathematics of their hunger. See, medieval farming operated on a ratio that made survival a yearly gamble, and when I show you the numbers, when you see exactly how close they were to disaster even in good years, you'll understand why 1315 felt like the end of the world. So take a deep breath. Let the weight of what we've just explored settle in. And when you're ready, we'll dive into something that sounds boring but is absolutely fascinating. The brutal arithmetic that decided who lived and who died. Let me think about the numbers for a moment. Because when you understand the math behind medieval survival, everything else makes sense. You know what's wild? Modern farmers can plant one seed and harvest 30 seeds back. 30 to 1. It's so efficient we barely think about it. But in medieval Europe, on a really good year, and I mean everything going perfectly, a peasant might get 7 seeds back for every one they planted. 7 to 1. That was considered a blessing, a genuine miracle worth thanking God for. But here's the thing that should make your stomach drop. In a bad year, they'd get 2 seeds back, 2 to 1. And suddenly, you're staring at a math problem that has only one solution: starvation. Let me break this down because it's actually fascinating in a terrifying way. Imagine you're a peasant farmer in, say, 1310. You've got a field, and you plant 100 seeds of wheat. In a good year, sunshine, moderate rain, no pests, no disease, you harvest 700 seeds. Sounds great, right? But hold on. You need to save 100 of those seeds to plant next year. That's non-negotiable. Without seed, there is no future. So now you've got 600 seeds for everything else. You've got to pay rent to your lord. That's usually about a third of your harvest. So there goes 200 seeds. Now you're down to 400. You need to feed your family for an entire year until the next harvest. If you've got a wife and 3 kids, you're looking at maybe 5 people. 400 seeds divided across 12 months, 5 people. It's tight, really tight, but it's doable. Now imagine a bad year. You plant 100 seeds and you only get 200 back. You still need 100 for next year's planting. That hasn't changed. You still owe rent. Your lord doesn't care about the weather. That's your problem. So there goes 66 seeds. Now you've got 34 seeds to feed 5 people for 12 months. 34. That's not tight. That's impossible. That's you choosing which child eats today. See, this is what makes the Great Famine so devastating. It wasn't just One bad year, it was 3 years in a row where the ratios collapsed. And here's the trap that medieval people fell into. A trap so cruel it still makes me angry when I think about it. After that first bad harvest in 1315, people were hungry, desperately hungry, so some of them ate their seed grain. Can you blame them? When your daughter is crying from hunger pains, are you really going to let her suffer while grain sits in your storage? Of course not. You're going to feed her. Which means in 1316 you've got even less seed to plant, which means an even smaller harvest, which means more people eating seed grain. You see the spiral? It's a death trap made of arithmetic. And we know this happened because chroniclers recorded it. There's this account from 1317 that just breaks my heart. By this point, people were so desperate that seed grain, just the seed for planting, was being sold at insane prices. A bushel of seed could produce 4 bushels of wheat in a decent year, but people were eating the bushel instead of planting it. They were literally consuming their future because the present was unbearable. But let's rewind a bit, because the Great Famine wasn't the first time Europeans learned this lesson. Let me tell you about Scotland in 1260, a story that doesn't get told nearly enough. 55 years before the Great Famine, Scotland experienced what chroniclers called a great food shortage. The records tell us that a bowl of flour, that's a unit of measurement, roughly equivalent to 6 bushels, was selling for 4 shillings. Now that might not mean much to you, but to put it in perspective, that was approximately 4 times the normal price. 4 times. And this was during the medieval warm period, remember? This was during the good times. Chronicles from that era describe scenes that feel like they're from a horror movie. People harvesting wild roots and grass from forests, communities turning on each other. And here's what really haunts me. There's this account of a peasant called Christy Cleek. Actually, wait, that was later. But the 1260 crisis has its own dark tales of social breakdown. The point is, even during the warm centuries, even when the climate was cooperating, the system was fragile. One region could have a bad harvest, and suddenly people were dying. Because there was no safety net. No way to transport food from areas with surplus to areas with shortage. No government stockpiles. Nothing. You want to know who did have stockpiles? The church, royalty, lords, rich merchants. They kept emergency grain supplies that could last for years. But peasants? Peasants lived harvest to harvest, and sometimes meal to meal. The elite had margin for error. The poor had none. And here's something that really illustrates how precarious this all was. The calendar itself was a trap. Let's say you make it through a bad winter. Barely. You've rationed every seed, every scrap of dried meat. You've survived. It's now March, and you need to plant for the next harvest. But the ground is still frozen. You wait. April comes. Ground's still too cold. You're getting nervous now because late planting means late harvest means less time for grain to ripen before the next winter. Finally, May arrives, and the soil is workable. You plant your precious saved seeds, and now you wait, and wait, and pray. The harvest won't come until August or September. That's 4 to 5 months of waiting with your food supplies at their absolute lowest. This period, late winter through early summer, was called the Hungry Gap by historians. It's when food from last year's harvest was running out, but food from this year's harvest wasn't ready yet. This was when people died. Not during the harvest, not during the winter necessarily, during the spring. During the time of renewal and rebirth, people were starving. There's something deeply cruel about that, isn't there? Nature waking up all around you while you're too weak to walk. Now let me blow your mind with some population numbers, because this is where you really see how the system was straining even before crisis hit. By 1300, Europe had approximately 75 million people. That's more than double what it had been in 1000 AD. And here's the kicker. Parts of Europe didn't reach that population level again until the 1800s, 500 years later. We're talking about medieval France having more people in some regions than modern France. How's that possible? Because they'd expanded farming into every single piece of marginally farmable land. Hillsides, forests that got cleared, wetlands that got drained. Every square metre that could produce food was being used. Imagine a theatre that's legally allowed to hold 300 people. Now imagine cramming 500 people into it. Everyone's touching. There's no room to move. The fire exits are blocked. Everything's fine until it's not. That was Europe by 1300, operating at maximum capacity with zero margin for error. And here's what medieval people didn't have that we take for granted. They couldn't import food from across the ocean. There was no Australia sending wheat, no Americas sending corn. Corn didn't even exist in Europe yet. What grew within walking distance of your village was all you had. If your region failed, you starved. Simple as that. This is why one bad harvest could kill millions. It's not that medieval people were stupid or didn't know how to farm. They were actually incredibly skilled at squeezing every possible calorie from the land. But when you're already operating at the absolute limit, any disruption is catastrophic. It's like a tightrope walker. One small gust of wind is the difference between making it across and falling to your death. Let's talk about salt again, but from a different angle than before. We talked about how salt preserved meat, how the rain made it impossible to produce. But here's what I didn't mention. Salt was also essential for the harvest itself. You needed salt to preserve fish, one of the main protein sources for peasants, especially during religious fast days when you couldn't eat meat. No salt meant fish rotted within days. Salt was used in cheese making. Salt was used to cure leather for shoes and tools. Salt was the blockchain of the medieval economy. Everything ran on it. And when salt prices quintupled during the Great Famine period, it wasn't just about meat. It was about the collapse of multiple essential industries at once. The whole system was interconnected, and salt was one of the load-bearing pillars. Do you ever think about how dependent we are on systems we don't control? Maybe you do, especially after the last few years of supply chain disruptions and pandemic shortages. But imagine if those disruptions lasted not for weeks or months, but for years. And imagine if the thing that was disrupted wasn't toilet paper or computer chips, but food itself. That's what medieval people faced. You know what the seed ratio thing reminds me of? Modern just-in-time manufacturing. Companies don't keep huge stockpiles anymore. They order exactly what they need, exactly when they need it. Super efficient until something breaks. Then suddenly there are no masks, no ventilators, no semiconductors. Medieval agriculture was the ultimate just-in-time system, except instead of manufacturing iPhones, they were manufacturing survival. And when the supply chain broke, people died. Here's a question I want you to sit with for a moment. If our modern food system collapsed, I mean really collapsed, how long would you last? Most American cities have about 3 days of food in their supply chain. 3 days. After that, the shelves are empty. Now we have social safety nets and emergency systems that medieval people didn't have. But the fundamental fragility, that's still there, hiding under the surface of our convenience. Medieval peasants knew something we've forgotten. You're never more than 1 or 2 bad seasons away from disaster. They lived with that knowledge every single day. It made them careful, resourceful. It also made them vulnerable in ways we can barely comprehend. And that brings me to the most important lesson from all this mathematical misery. The lesson that historians and economists and policymakers still haven't fully absorbed. Complex systems fail in predictable ways. When you push any system to its maximum capacity, you eliminate resilience. Medieval Europe was running at 100% capacity when the weather turned. There was no slack in the system, no buffer, no plan B. So when shock came, and shock always comes eventually, the system didn't bend, it broke. The difference between 7-1 and 2-1 sounds mathematical, abstract. But that ratio was the difference between your children living and dying, between hope and despair, between a society that functions and one that descends into the desperate measures we talked about earlier. So here's what I want you to understand as we move forward. When I tell you in the next sections about what medieval people ate, how they preserved food, how they rationed and shared and survived, I want you to remember these numbers. Remember that they were doing all of this while operating on the edge of a mathematical cliff. Every strategy, every technique, every tradition they developed was designed to squeeze just a little bit more survival out of an unforgiving equation. Because knowing the numbers makes the survival strategies even more impressive. When you understand how little they had, how narrow their margins were, the ingenuity of their solutions becomes breathtaking. They weren't working with abundance. They were performing miracles with scraps. So let's talk about those scraps. Let's talk about what actually went into the pot, into the belly, into the body, that had to somehow keep working through a winter that wanted nothing more than to kill you. Because the daily reality of medieval food, what they ate, how they made it, why it was the way it was, that's where this story gets really intimate. That's where we stop talking about millions dying and start talking about how a single family survived one more day. Picture a cast iron pot. It's hanging over a fire that never fully goes out, and inside that pot is a thick, bubbling stew. Now here's the strange part. That stew has been cooking for 3 days, maybe 4, maybe longer. Every morning someone adds water, tosses in whatever vegetables are available, a handful of barley if you're lucky, and the pot just keeps simmering, day after day, week after week. That pot, that one humble blackened pot, kept more people alive through medieval winters than any other invention in human history. They called it pottage, and if you were a peasant, it was probably 80% of everything you ate. Close your eyes for a second and imagine eating the same meal for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Now imagine eating that same meal every single day for 4 months straight. That's winter for a medieval peasant. The same thick greyish stew morning and night, barely changing flavour because the ingredients barely changed. Sounds miserable, right? But here's what's fascinating. That monotony was a survival strategy. The eternal pot wasn't laziness, it was genius. Let me explain why. When you keep a pot simmering constantly, you're doing something our ancestors understood intuitively. You're making food safer. Low, constant heat kills bacteria and parasites that would otherwise make you sick. In a world without refrigeration, without understanding of germ theory, without any way to keep food fresh, the eternal pot was a form of insurance. As long as the fire stayed lit and the pot stayed hot, whatever went into it became safe to eat. Mouldy bread, toss it in. Questionable vegetables, into the pot. The heat purified everything. But what actually went into pottage? Because I think we have this image of medieval peasants eating meat and bread and hearty meals. That's not reality. That's what lords ate. Let me paint you the real picture. The base of pottage was always grain, barley mostly, sometimes oats, rye if you were desperate, and we'll talk about why rye was dangerous in a moment. You'd boil the grain until it broke down into a thick porridge-like consistency. That's your foundation, your carbohydrates, your calories, your reason you don't collapse in the fields. Then came the vegetables. And when I say vegetables, I mean whatever was available in your garden or root cellar. Onions, always onions, because they stored well and added flavour to otherwise bland mush. Turnips, cabbage, if you had it. Peas and beans, both fresh in summer and dried in winter. Lentils occasionally. Maybe some colewort, which is basically medieval kale. Here's what didn't go into peasant pottage. Meat. Almost never meat. You know why? Because meat was incredibly expensive. Up to 4 times the cost of bread. And peasants didn't just raise animals for fun. That pig or chicken represented a year's investment. You fed it scraps all year long, and in return, it was your savings account. Killing it meant converting your wealth into a meal. Most families couldn't afford that more than once or twice a year. So pottage was vegetarian by necessity, not choice. But there was one exception, and it's pretty dark. During November, which we'll dive deeper into later, families would slaughter their pig. The best cuts got salted and preserved for special occasions, but the blood, the organs, the bits that wouldn't keep, those went into the eternal pot. Blood sausage, what the English called black pudding, was poor people's food. You'd collect the pig's blood in a bowl, mix it with grain and fat, stuff it into intestines and boil it. Then you'd slice it up and add it to your pottage for protein. If you're squeamish, I get it. But when you're burning 2,900 calories a day doing manual labour, you don't waste anything, especially not protein. Speaking of calories, let's talk about just how much food medieval peasants needed. Historians estimate that an adult male peasant required about 2,900 calories per day. Women needed around 2,150. Those numbers sound high compared to modern recommendations, right? That's because we're sedentary. We sit in chairs and type on keyboards. Medieval peasants were ploughing fields behind oxen, hauling water from wells, chopping wood, building fences, harvesting grain with hand scythes. 12-hour workdays during summer, physical labour that would hospitalize most of us within a week. They needed fuel. And here's how they got those calories. Bread. So much bread. On average, a working peasant ate 2 to 3 pounds of bread per day. Per day. That's like eating 6 or 7 Subway sandwiches worth of bread every single day. Bread was life. It was portable energy. You could take it to the fields, gnaw on it while working, dip it in your pottage to soften it. Medieval bread wasn't like our fluffy supermarket loaves, though. It was dense, dark, heavy, made from rye or barley, sometimes mixed with cheaper fillers like ground peas, beans, or, in desperate times, acorns. But here's where it gets dangerous. Rye bread had a hidden killer, ergot fungus. You ever heard of ergot poisoning? It's what happens when a specific fungus infects rye grain. The fungus produces compounds that are basically natural LSD, except instead of a trippy experience, you get convulsions, hallucinations, gangrene, and sometimes death. Medieval people called it St. Anthony's fire, because it felt like your limbs were burning from the inside. In wet years, like say during the Great Famine when nothing would dry properly, ergot infections exploded. People ate their bread and then went mad. Literally. Limbs turned black and fell off. Entire villages experienced mass hallucinations, and nobody understood why because they didn't know about fungus. They thought it was divine punishment. Imagine eating bread, your main source of calories, the thing keeping you alive, and not knowing if this particular loaf might kill you or drive you insane. That was the gamble every single day. Now, let's talk preservation. Because the food you could eat in January depended entirely on what you managed to preserve back in September. Medieval people had 3 main preservation techniques, and they used them brilliantly. First, salting. We talked about salt shortages earlier, but let me show you how it actually worked. When you salt meat or fish heavily, you're basically dehydrating it at a microscopic level. Salt draws moisture out of both the food and any bacteria trying to grow on it. No moisture, no bacterial growth. So you'd pack meat in layers of salt, expensive, precious salt, and store it in a cool place. When you wanted to eat it, you'd soak it in water for hours to remove the salt, then cook it. The result? Meat that was safe to eat months later, though incredibly salty and tough. But tough meat was better than no meat. Second, smoking. Smoke contains compounds that inhibit bacterial growth and add flavour. You'd hang meat or fish in a smokehouse, basically a small shed with a fire pit, and let smoke circulate around it for days or even weeks. The surface would dry out and form a protective barrier. Smoked fish, especially herring and cod, became a staple for coastal communities. Inland peasants would smoke pork. The taste was intense, so smoky and strong that it would overpower everything else in your pottage. But again, intense flavour was better than rotting meat. Third, drying. This one's simple, but effective. You'd slice meat or fish very thin and hang it in the sun and wind. The moisture would evaporate, leaving behind concentrated protein that was light and shelf-stable. Dried peas, beans and lentils could last years if kept dry. Herbs would be bundled and hung from rafters. Even fruit could be dried, apples especially. Medieval people made a kind of fruit leather by cooking down apples and spreading the paste thin to dry. It wasn't candy, but it was sweet, and sweetness was rare. Here's what amazes me about these techniques. They worked. They worked so well that we still use variations of them today. Your grandmother's canned vegetables, medieval preservation logic, that expensive prosciutto at the fancy restaurant, medieval salting technique, beef jerky, medieval drying method. These weren't primitive people fumbling in the dark. These were sophisticated food scientists working without the benefit of written recipes or scientific understanding, just generations of trial and error and knowledge passed down. But even with all these preservation techniques, even with the eternal pot and the daily bread, winter was a time of incredible scarcity, which meant people had to get creative. And by creative I mean desperate. When food supplies ran low, really low, people turned to the forests. Foraging became survival. And I'm not talking about picking blackberries for fun. I'm talking about stripping bark from trees and boiling it to extract whatever minimal nutrition it contained. Digging up roots from frozen ground with your bare hands because you didn't have gloves. Collecting acorns, which are toxic without proper preparation, and going through the laborious process of leaching out the tannin so they wouldn't poison you. Grinding grass seeds to make a kind of flour that was more fibre than food, but at least filled your stomach. There are accounts from famine years of people eating things that would horrify us. Boiled leather from old shoes, straw meant for animal bedding. There's this heartbreaking detail from the 1315 famine about people harvesting what they called famine foods, plants that weren't normally eaten because they tasted terrible or had minimal nutrition, things like nettle leaves, which sting your hand when you pick them, wild garlic that was so pungent it made you sick. But when the alternative is watching your family starve, you eat the nettles. You know what's interesting, though? Some of these famine foods were actually pretty nutritious. Nettles, for example, are loaded with vitamins and minerals. Dandelion greens, which medieval people ate when desperate, are more nutritious than lettuce. Wild mushrooms could provide protein. The problem wasn't that these foods were worthless. The problem was that there weren't enough of them. When an entire village descends on the forest looking for anything edible, the forest gets picked clean pretty quickly. And here's something that really highlights the ingenuity of medieval food culture. Root cellars. These weren't just holes in the ground. They were carefully engineered storage systems designed to keep vegetables at the perfect temperature, cold enough to prevent rot, but not so cold that they'd freeze and turn to mush. You'd dig down below the frost line the pit with stones for drainage, and store your turnips, carrots, beets, and onions in layers of straw or sand. The earth itself acted as insulation. If done right, a root cellar could keep vegetables fresh from October all the way through March or April. That's 6 months of fresh vegetables without any modern technology. Just understanding of temperature, moisture, and airflow. Have you ever thought about what it would be like to go 6 months eating only what you could store? No grocery store runs, no DoorDash, no, "Oh, I'm craving Thai food tonight." Just turnips, and more turnips. And if you're really lucky, some onions with your turnips. The psychological weight of that monotony is something we can barely imagine. But here's what medieval people understood that we've forgotten. Boredom is a luxury. Being bored with your food means you have food. Complaining about the same meal every day means you're eating every day. The eternal pot might have been monotonous, but it was also reliable. And reliability, in a world of constant uncertainty, was worth more than variety. There's this German saying that apparently dates back to medieval times, though I can't confirm the exact origin. Hunger is the best spice. When you've been working in freezing temperatures for 12 hours, when your body is screaming for calories, when you haven't eaten since dawn and it's now dusk, that bowl of grey, lumpy pottage tastes like heaven. It's warm, it's filling, it stops the gnawing in your stomach. That's all food needs to be sometimes. Not Instagram-worthy, not innovative, just there. And maybe that's the lesson we've lost in our age of food abundance and endless variety. We've forgotten the simple magic of having enough, of that deep satisfaction that comes from genuine hunger being met with simple food. Medieval peasants didn't need 17 spices and 3 types of cheese. They needed calories and warmth and the knowledge that there would be another bowl available in a few hours. But here's the thing about that eternal pot, about that dark bread, about those preserved foods. They couldn't exist without fire, without warmth, without some way to keep the cold at bay long enough to cook, to eat, to survive another night, and staying warm in a medieval winter. That's where the real ingenuity shows up. Because when your house has no insulation, when your clothes are barely adequate, when fuel is scarce and expensive, how do you keep from freezing to death in your sleep? That's the question we need to answer next. Because medieval people had tricks, some of them surprising, some of them uncomfortable, all of them essential. The architecture of warmth in a world without central heating is a story of desperation meeting creativity. And some of their solutions, they might actually make you grateful for whatever's keeping you warm right now. There's this moment that changed European architecture forever, and it starts with a French queen who was just really, really cold. The year is 1137. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, has just married Louis VII of France. She's moving from the sunny south of France to the cold, draughty castles of the north, and she's absolutely miserable. The stone walls radiate cold. The wind howls through gaps in the doors. The great halls are so vast that any heat just rises up and disappears into the vaulted ceilings. So Eleanor does something revolutionary. She orders fireplaces to be built into the walls of her husband's castles. Not fire pits in the centre of rooms, not braziers, actual fireplaces with chimneys that vent smoke outside. And here's the crazy part. This was considered innovative, luxury. Most of Europe wouldn't adopt fireplaces widely until the 13th century, more than 100 years later. Before Eleanor's intervention, almost everyone, from peasants to minor nobility, relied on open hearths, and those hearths were exactly as miserable as they sound. Picture a peasant house in, say, 1250. You walk through the door, there's only one door, and immediately your eyes start watering. The room is hazy with smoke. In the centre of the floor there's a circle of stones with a fire burning. Above it, a hole in the roof. That's your ventilation system, a literal hole. The smoke is supposed to rise up and escape through that hole. Supposed to. In reality, wind would blow the smoke sideways, or rain would come through the hole and nearly extinguish your fire, or the smoke would just hang in the air because that's what smoke does when you don't have proper ventilation. Everyone who lived in these houses had chronic respiratory problems, constant coughing, lung damage, your clothes, your hair, your skin. Everything smelled like wood smoke 24/7. And here's the thing. That smell wasn't just unpleasant. It was your deodorant. Medieval people knew they smelled from hard labour and infrequent bathing, but the smoke was so overwhelming it actually masked body odour. Sort of a trade-off. You could either smell like sweat or smell like a campfire. They chose campfire. But why suffer through all that smoke? Why not just build better heating systems? And the answer is, they couldn't afford to. Building a proper fireplace required skilled masons, expensive materials, and architectural knowledge that most people simply didn't have access to. A fireplace with a chimney meant cutting through stone walls, constructing a flue that wouldn't collapse, maintaining the mortar. It was wealthy people's technology. For everyone else, you made do with a pit and a prayer. Let me describe what a typical peasant house actually looked like, because I think we have this romantic notion from movies. These weren't cosy cottages, they were survival boxes. The walls were made using wattle and daub. Basically, you'd weave sticks together to create a lattice, then plaster both sides with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung. It was a binder and an insulator. Once it dried, you'd have walls about 6 inches thick, which sounds substantial until you realise that modern insulation in your walls is probably better than 6 inches of mud and poop. The roof was thatched, layers of dried grass, reeds or straw. Thatching was actually pretty effective at keeping rain out when properly maintained, but it also trapped smoke inside, harboured vermin, and would occasionally catch fire from sparks. A thatched roof in winter would get soggy, heavy, and start to rot. By spring you'd need repairs, which meant more straw, more labour, more expense. Everything required constant maintenance just to stay barely functional. And the floor? Packed dirt, sometimes covered with rushes, basically dried grass, to provide a little cushioning and absorb moisture. But those rushes would get disgusting. Food scraps, animal waste, human waste if someone got sick, all ground into the floor covering. You'd replace the rushes periodically, but it was always sort of organic. Let's just say that. Medieval houses had a smell that would probably make us gag within seconds. So you've got smoke-filled air, drafty walls, a hole in your roof, and a dirt floor. How cold did it actually get inside? Well, we don't have thermometers from the medieval period, but historians estimate that on a winter night, indoor temperatures in a peasant house might only be 10 to 15 degrees warmer than outside. If it's 20 degrees outside, it's maybe 35 inside. That's still below freezing. You're just freezing slower. Which brings us to the most important medieval heating technology, one that doesn't require any fuel at all. Body heat. Humans are basically furnaces. We generate heat just by existing. A resting adult produces about as much heat as a 100-watt light bulb. Not much, right? But here's the clever part. If you put multiple humans in a small space and trap that heat, things warm up fast. Medieval people understood this instinctively. Families didn't spread out through multiple rooms. Everyone slept in the same room, often in the same bed. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, all piled together under whatever blankets or furs they had. Body heat pooling together, keeping everyone from freezing. And it wasn't just humans. Animals slept in the house too. In many peasant homes, there wasn't a clear division between human space and animal space. Your house was basically one big room with your cow, your pig, your chicken all sheltering in one end while you slept in the other. Now, before you recoil in disgust, think about the thermal logic. A cow produces about the same heat as 1700 watts. That's 17 light bulbs. A pig is like 700 watts. You're basically using livestock as space heaters. Sure, the smell was atrocious. Sure, you were stepping around manure every morning, but you weren't freezing to death. Some cultures took this even further. In Russia, the traditional peasant home centered around a massive masonry stove called a pech. These things were architectural marvels. They'd burn hot during the day for cooking, then radiate warmth all night. And here's the genius part. The top of the stove was flat and wide, creating a sleeping platform called the polot. Families would climb up and sleep directly on the warm stone. 6 people could sleep up there comfortably. Elderly people and children got priority. They needed the warmth most. The healthiest adults would sleep on benches near the stove. Russians also used these stoves for bathing. They'd heat the surface until it was almost too hot to touch, spread straw on top, place a cast iron tub filled with water on the straw, and boom, you've got a hot bath. Children would be lifted into the tub with a special wooden spade because the stove was too hot to climb. Adults climbed in themselves. The whole family would bathe one after another, using the same water because heating that much water took enormous fuel. But most European peasants didn't have fancy Russian stoves. They had their fire pit, their body heat, and one other trick: heated stones. Before bed, you'd select a flat stone, maybe a river rock you'd collected specifically for this purpose, and place it directly in the fire. Let it heat for an hour or two until it was almost glowing. Then, very carefully, using sticks or a primitive tong, you'd lift it out, wrap it in cloth or an old piece of leather, and carry it to your bed. Tuck it under the blankets near your feet. Instant warmth that would last for hours. There's something almost tender about that ritual, isn't it? In a world of brutal survival, taking the time to warm a stone for cold feet. It's such a human gesture, and risky too. If you didn't wrap it properly, you could burn yourself or set your bedding on fire. But people did it anyway because the alternative was lying awake all night, teeth chattering, unable to sleep. Sleep was actually one of the biggest challenges of medieval winter. When you're constantly cold, your body can't fully relax. You sleep lightly, wake frequently, never get truly restorative rest. This chronic sleep deprivation made people more vulnerable to illness, more prone to accidents, more irritable and prone to conflict. Some historians suggest that the uptick in domestic violence during winter months was partly due to everyone being exhausted, confined to small spaces, and perpetually uncomfortable. And let's talk about what you wore to bed, because medieval people didn't have pajamas. You just slept in whatever you'd been wearing all day. Maybe you'd remove your outer layer, your cloak or heavy tunic, but your underlayers stayed on. Linen undergarments, woolen outer garments, all of it on your body 24/7. You'd only fully undress for bathing, which happened maybe once a month if you were conscientious. So picture this. You're wearing the same clothes for weeks, sleeping in them, sweating in them, and then spending your days in smoke-filled rooms. The aroma must have been formidable. But you know what? Nobody noticed. When everyone smells the same, nobody smells. It's only noticeable when there's contrast. And in a medieval village there was no contrast. Everyone was equally ripe. Now here's something that might surprise you. Churches were actually colder than homes. Those massive stone structures with high ceilings and stained glass windows. Beautiful, but absolutely frigid in winter. Which is why wealthy people, and even some regular churchgoers, brought portable hand warmers to Mass. These were hollow metal spheres, usually brass or iron, with perforated designs. You'd fill them with hot coals from your home fire, close them up and carry them to church. The coals would glow inside, radiating heat through the perforations. You'd hold it in your hands during the service or tuck it under your clothes. Basically a medieval hot hands packet, except it could actually burn you if you weren't careful. The irony is that while peasants froze, the truly wealthy weren't much warmer. Those castles and manor houses Eleanor complained about. They were engineering nightmares, massive great halls where the Lord would hold court, host feasts, conduct business. These rooms might be 50 feet long, 30 feet wide, with ceilings 20 feet high. You could build a roaring fire in the centre of the room, a fire big enough to roast an entire deer, and people more than 10 feet away would still be cold. Heat rises, and in those vast spaces it just rose right up and did nothing useful. Lords wore their heavy cloaks indoors. Ladies kept fur-lined blankets on their laps. Servants who had to stand still for hours probably suffered more from cold than peasants who could at least huddle near their smaller, more efficient fires. There's this medieval illustration from the Très Riche Heure, a book of hours created for the Duke of Berry, showing peasants in February. They're inside, supposedly sheltering from winter, and you can see them warming themselves by a fire. But here's what's darkly hilarious. They're not just standing near the fire. They've hiked up their tunics and are warming their bare backsides directly by the flames. Their genitals are literally exposed to maximize heat absorption. The illustrator didn't shy away from this detail. It was reality. When you're that cold, modesty becomes negotiable. How much wood did a typical household burn through? The estimates vary wildly depending on region and house size, but scholars suggest a peasant family might need several cords of wood to make it through winter. A cord is a stack of wood 4 feet high, 8 feet long, and 4 feet deep. Now, most peasants weren't allowed to just go chop down trees. The forests were owned by the lord, and cutting living trees was forbidden. Those were valuable resources for construction and lord's fuel. Peasants were allowed to collect deadfall, branches and trees that had already fallen, which meant you were constantly competing with your neighbours for limited fallen wood. You'd walk the forest with a cart, picking up sticks, dragging branches home, anything that would burn. And here's the catch. Wet wood doesn't burn well. In a rainy autumn or snowy winter, everything is damp. You'd have to store wood inside your already cramped house to dry it out before burning, which took up precious space and made your home even smokier when that damp wood finally went into the fire. It was an endless cycle of problems compounding problems. Some regions burned peat instead of wood. That's partially decomposed plant material dug from bogs. It burns slower and hotter than wood, but it also produces thick, acrid smoke. Other areas burned animal dung after drying it. Yes, burning poop for warmth. Not ideal, but when the alternative is freezing, you burn what's available. The psychological toll of all this shouldn't be underestimated. Imagine spending 5 months, October through February, in a state of constant low-grade physical discomfort. You're never quite warm, never quite dry, never quite comfortable. Your home is dark because windows are tiny. Glass is expensive, and even oiled parchment windows don't let in much light. Your home is smoky. It smells. Everyone is cramped together. There's no privacy, no escape, no relief. Is it any wonder that medieval people celebrated spring with such intensity? When the first warm day came, that first day you could go outside without multiple layers, when you could open your door and let fresh air circulate, when the sun actually felt warm on your face, it must have felt like resurrection, like being released from prison. And yet people adapted. Generation after generation learned to survive these conditions. They didn't complain much in the historical record because this was just life. This was normal. You didn't write in your diary about how cold you were any more than you write about breathing. It was simply the baseline of existence. But there was one crucial element we haven't fully explored yet. The thing that made the difference between being miserably cold and being dangerously cold. Your clothing. Because what you wore wasn't fashion. It wasn't self-expression. It was the barrier between you and death. And the technology of medieval clothing, the materials, the layering, the techniques, that's where you really see human ingenuity pushed to its limits. Because when your body is the furnace, your clothes are the walls that keep the heat from escaping. And medieval people understood this in ways we've completely forgotten. Wool is magic. I know that sounds dramatic, but once you understand the science of what wool actually does, you'll realize medieval people had stumbled onto one of nature's most perfect survival materials. And they didn't just use it, they built an entire survival system around it. Think about the last time you wore a wool sweater. It's probably itchy, right? Maybe a little scratchy against your skin. That's because wool fibers have these tiny scales on them that create friction. Modern people consider this a flaw. We want soft, comfortable fabrics. But medieval people understood something we've forgotten, that uncomfortable texture is actually a feature, not a bug. Those scales trap air, and trapped air is insulation. It's the same principle that makes double-paned windows work. The same reason bubble wrap protects packages. Air is an incredible insulator, and wool is essentially a network of tiny air pockets wrapped around your body. But here's where wool gets really interesting, and this is the part that saved countless lives. Wool retains warmth even when wet. Think about that for a second. If you get your cotton shirt soaking wet, you're immediately cold. The water conducts heat away from your body, and you start shivering. But wool? Wool can absorb up to 30% of its weight in water and still keep you warm. The structure of the fiber actually generates heat through a chemical process when it absorbs moisture. It's called the heat absorption. Medieval people had no idea about the chemistry, but they knew empirically that a wet wool cloak was infinitely better than a wet linen shirt. So imagine you're a peasant in medieval England. It's January. You're walking through snow to check on your lord's sheep. Yes, you have to work even in winter, we'll get to that. You're wearing wool because what else would you wear? You start sweating from the exertion. That sweat gets absorbed by the wool, and instead of making you colder, it actually generates a tiny bit of warmth. Then it starts snowing. Your outer layer gets damp, but you're still warm, still functional, still alive. That's the miracle of wool. The problem, of course, was that wool was also incredibly itchy. Imagine wearing a Brillo pad against your bare skin for 5 months straight. You'd develop rashes, irritation, maybe open sores that could get infected. So medieval people developed a 2-layer system that was honestly kind of brilliant. The base layer was always linen. Linen is made from flax plants, and unlike wool, it's smooth, soft against the skin. It also absorbs moisture really well, even better than wool, which meant it would wick sweat away from your body. So you'd wear a linen shirt and linen braies, basically medieval underwear that looked like loose shorts. The linen sat against your skin, absorbing sweat and providing a barrier. Then over that you'd wear wool, a wool tunic, wool hose, that's stockings, a wool coat, maybe a wool cloak. The wool provided insulation and weather protection. The linen provided comfort and moisture management. It's the same principle as modern athletic wear. Base layer for moisture, outer layer for insulation. Medieval people figured this out through trial and error over centuries. Now here's something most people don't realize. You almost never wash the wool. Water and agitation would make wool shrink and lose its structure. So you might wash your linen undergarments, boil them actually to kill lice and other parasites, but your wool outer layers, those got worn until they fell apart, which could be years. You'd air them out occasionally, maybe brush off visible dirt, but washing was rare. And remember what we talked about earlier. The smoke from your home fire would permeate the wool, acting as a kind of deodorant and pest repellent. So your wool clothing was basically marinated in wood smoke, which masked the smell of sweat and possibly deterred some insects. How many layers would someone wear in winter? It depended on what you were doing, and this is where medieval people showed real sophistication. They understood something that modern hikers and outdoors people relearn. Don't wear so many layers that you sweat profusely, because then you'll get wet and cold. The key was to adjust your layers based on your activity level. If you were going to be doing heavy labour, splitting wood, hauling water, working in the barn, you'd start with fewer layers. Maybe just your linen underlayer and one wool tunic. As you worked and generated body heat, you'd stay warm without overheating. Then, when you stopped to rest, you'd immediately add layers. Throw on your wool coat, wrap your cloak around your shoulders. The moment your activity level dropped, your heat generation dropped, and you needed more insulation. If you were going to be relatively stationary, standing guard, travelling in a cart, attending church, you'd start with maximum layers. Linen base, wool tunic, wool coat, wool cloak, wool mittens, wool cap. Everything. Because you weren't generating much heat through activity, so you needed maximum insulation. There's this wonderful Swedish saying that apparently goes back centuries. There is no bad weather, just bad clothing. Medieval people lived by this principle. They had to. Your clothing wasn't a fashion statement. It was survival equipment that you maintained, repaired, and strategized about every single day. Let's talk about the extremities, because that's where things get really creative. Your head, hands, and feet. These are where you lose heat fastest. Blood vessels are close to the surface, and there's not much muscle mass to generate warmth. Medieval people understood this instinctively, even without knowing the physiology. Hats were non-negotiable in winter. Usually wool, sometimes fur-lined if you could afford it. And not just any hat. These were caps that covered your ears and sometimes tied under your chin. There's actually a physiological reason why keeping your head warm helps your feet stay warm. When your head gets cold, your body panics and starts shunting blood away from your extremities to protect your vital organs and brain. So cold head equals cold feet, even if your feet are well insulated. Medieval people figured this out through observation. Wear a hat, and your feet hurt less from cold. They didn't know why, but they knew it worked. Mittens were common, but not the kind you're thinking of. Modern mittens have one section for your thumb and one for your other 4 fingers. Medieval working mittens often had just 2 sections, a thumb and then everything else. Or sometimes they were like modern mittens but with only 3 sections. Thumb, first 2 fingers together, last 2 fingers together. Why? Because fine motor control wasn't the goal. Warmth was, and keeping your fingers grouped together meant more shared body heat. Some mittens were made from wool, others from padded leather, and for the really poor or in particularly desperate times, people made mittens from whatever they had. Old pieces of cloth sewn together, rabbit fur if you'd trapped rabbits, even woven plant fibers. The goal wasn't elegance. The goal was keeping your fingers attached to your hands. Now, feet. This is where medieval ingenuity gets really interesting. Leather boots were the ideal, but leather was expensive. A good pair of boots might cost a peasant a month's wages or more. So many people, maybe even most people, made do with much simpler footwear. Leather shoes that were more like slippers, cloth wrapped around the feet, or in some cases wooden clogs. But here's the brilliant part. People stuffed their shoes with straw. There's this German poem from the 13th century called Meyer Helmbrecht that describes peasants who dance so wildly that the straw comes flying out of their boots. That's not metaphor, that's literal documentation. People would pack loose straw into their shoes for insulation. The straw created air pockets, kept their feet off cold leather sole, absorbed some moisture. When the straw got too compressed or wet, you'd pull it out and stuff in fresh straw. Free insulation that was everywhere. Some regions took this further. In Sweden there was actually a grass called shoe grass that was specifically harvested for stuffing into footwear, and archaeologists have found wool that appears to have been stuffed loosely into shoes, worn for so long that it felted together in the exact shape of the shoe. Imagine that. Your sock and your shoe insulation literally merging into one object over months of wear. Socks were made using a technique called knoll binding. That's needle binding, a kind of precursor to knitting. The Vikings used it, and it remained popular through the medieval period. You'd use a single needle to create a dense, stretchy fabric from wool. Knoll binding socks were incredibly durable and warm. They didn't unravel if you got a hole the way knitted socks do, and you could make them thick, really thick, for winter use. Some people would wear 2 or even 3 pairs of knoll-binding socks under their shoes. But let's be real, even with all these strategies, people's feet still froze. Frostbite was common. Loss of toes wasn't unusual. In extreme cold or during long journeys, your feet were always at risk. Which is why, when people were standing still for extended periods, standing guard, standing at a market, standing anywhere, they'd create little insulation platforms. If there was snow, you'd kick it away or compress it, then pile up branches, preferably fir or pine because the needles created air gaps, and stand on that. Lifting your feet even a few inches off the frozen ground made a huge difference. The ground conducts heat away from your body incredibly efficiently. Standing on branches, much better. Now let's talk about fur, because when we think of medieval fur, we think of kings and nobles in luxurious ermine and sable. But poor people wore fur too. They just wore different kinds. Peasants weren't allowed to hunt deer or large game. That was the lord's privilege. But they were usually allowed to trap small game on the lord's land. Rabbits, squirrels, sometimes foxes. When you caught a rabbit, you'd eat the meat, but you'd save pelt. And over time, you'd accumulate pelts. You'd tan them yourself, a process involving soaking the hide in animal brains, urine, or oak bark to preserve it. Not pleasant, but effective. Then you'd sew the pelts together or line your wool clothing with them. Rabbit fur is actually incredibly warm for its weight. It's not as prestigious as mink or sable, but it functions just as well as insulation. In England, the 1363 sumptuary law, that's a law that restricted what different social classes could wear, specifically addressed fur. Craftspeople and landowning peasants were allowed to wear fur made from lamb, rabbit, cat, or fox. That's it. No ermine, no sable, no beaver. Those were reserved for higher classes. The fact that there needed to be a law about this tells you 2 things. 1, that people were wearing furs, and 2, that some people were trying to wear furs above their station. Can you imagine what it would be like if we had laws today about what you could wear based on your job? If baristas were legally prohibited from wearing cashmere? It seems absurd to us, but in medieval Europe your clothing was supposed to reflect your social position. Dressing above your station was considered a form of lying. It upset the social order. But here's where it gets dark. There's this moral tale written in 1371 by a French knight for his daughters. It's a cautionary story about vanity, and it goes like this. A young woman was preparing for a visit from a handsome knight she hoped to marry. She wanted to look attractive, to show off her figure, to appear youthful and desirable. So even though it was winter, even though it was bitterly cold, she took off her fur-lined cloak and her warm wool layers. She wanted to look slim and elegant. The night arrived. They spent time together, and she was so focused on impressing him, so determined not to ruin the effect by putting her warm clothes back on, that she stayed cold for hours. By the time he left, she was shivering uncontrollably. Within days, she developed what the text calls a fever. Within a week, she was dead. Now, obviously, this is a morality tale. It's designed to teach young women that vanity is dangerous, that they should prioritize virtue over appearance. But the fact that froze to death because she wanted to look pretty was a plausible story tells you how serious the cold was. It wasn't an abstract threat. It was a real risk that people understood viscerally. If you chose fashion over function, you could literally die, and people did die from cold. We don't have great statistics because medieval record-keeping didn't track causes of death systematically, but coroners' rolls, these are legal records of death that required investigation, occasionally mention people found frozen, travellers who got caught in storms, elderly people who couldn't keep their fires going, homeless people who had no shelter at all. The winter killed people every year, and everyone knew it. So when medieval people bundled up, when they wore their layers of linen and wool, when they stuffed straw in their shoes, when they pulled their hoods up and tied them tight, they weren't being overly cautious. They were making rational survival decisions. Every choice mattered. Every layer was potentially the difference between living and dying. There's something deeply humbling about that, isn't there? We throw on a coat without thinking about it. We complain if our car takes a minute to warm up. We consider it a crisis if our house drops below 65 degrees. But medieval people lived in a state of constant thermal negotiation. Am I warm enough? Should I add a layer? Can I afford to take this off while I work? How long until I need to get back to the fire? And you know what? They developed an incredible tolerance for discomfort. When you're cold every day for 5 months, you stop registering it the same way. It becomes background noise. Your threshold for unbearably cold shifts dramatically. Something that would send us running for a heater becomes merely annoying to someone whose baseline is constant chill. There's a theory among historians that medieval people's sensory experience was fundamentally different from ours. They experienced extremes, extreme cold, extreme heat in summer, extreme hunger at times, extreme satiety after feasts that we rarely encounter. Their baseline for comfort was much broader than ours, which doesn't mean they suffered less. It means they processed suffering differently. They had to. The alternative was to be constantly, overwhelmingly miserable. So the mind adapts, the body acclimates. You find a way to function despite conditions we'd consider intolerable. But there's a limit to adaptation, a point where even the toughest, most acclimated person can't push through anymore. And that brings us to one of the strangest, most fascinating survival strategies documented in medieval and early modern Europe. A strategy so extreme, so counterintuitive, that when historians first encountered references to it, they thought it must be exaggeration or myth. But it wasn't. It was real. I'm talking about human hibernation. And before you say, wait, humans don't hibernate, let me tell you. Medieval peasants in some regions essentially did. They developed a survival strategy based on doing as little as possible, sleeping as much as possible, and reducing their caloric needs to the absolute minimum. It sounds like giving up. like despair. But it was actually a calculated response to impossible mathematics. When you don't have enough food to stay active all winter, when fuel is scarce, when there's no work to be done anyway, why not just sleep through it? This strategy has been documented from France, from Russia, from parts of Germany, and the details, the actual logistics of how people did this, are both fascinating and deeply unsettling, because it reveals just how far humans will go, just how much they'll sacrifice of what we consider living in order to simply survive. The first time historians encountered accounts of French peasants hibernating through winter, they dismissed it as folklore. Fantasy. Surely humans can't just sleep for months, except they did. And we have documentation that this practice continued well into the 19th century, long after the medieval period ended, which tells you just how deeply embedded this survival strategy was in rural culture. Let me paint you the scene, because it's both fascinating and deeply unsettling. It's late November in rural France, sometime in the 1700s. The harvest is done. What little food could be preserved is stored away. The calculations have been made and the math is brutal. There isn't enough. Not enough food to keep everyone fed and active all winter. Not enough fuel to keep fires burning continuously. Not enough work to justify staying awake and active. So families make a decision that would horrify us but made perfect sense to them. They prepare to sleep. First, they'd gather materials. Straw, mostly, left over from the harvest. Dried leaves if they could collect enough. Maybe some hay. They'd create nests, and that's the actual term used in historical accounts. Nests in the warmest corner of their home. Usually near where the animals were kept, because remember, body heat. These nests would be thick, insulating. You'd burrow into them like a hibernating animal. Then the family would settle in. And here's the part that seems unbelievable. They would sleep for most of the day and night, rising only once, sometimes twice, to eat a minimal meal and deal with biological necessities, then back to sleep, for weeks, sometimes months. This wasn't peaceful, restorative sleep. This was a survival tactic based on one simple principle. Sleeping humans need fewer calories than active humans. A lot fewer. When you're awake and active, you might need 2,500 to 3,000 calories a day. When you're sleeping most of the time, barely moving, maybe half that, maybe less. The body's metabolism slows down. You're not generating much heat through activity, but you're also not burning through your precious food stores. Now, you couldn't truly hibernate like a bear. Humans don't have the physiology for that. Bears actually lower their body temperature and slow their heart rate dramatically. Humans can't do that. We die, but we can sleep. A lot. And when you're malnourished, chronically cold, and there's nothing to do anyway, sleeping becomes surprisingly easy. Your body almost wants to shut down. But someone had to stay functional. Usually the women. They'd maintain the minimal fire, just enough to keep everyone from freezing, not enough to consume too much fuel. They'd prepare the once daily meal, usually that pottage we talked about earlier, but thinner, more watered down. They'd check on the children. They'd manage the animals. And then they'd sleep too, but less. Always less. Because someone needed to be semi-alert in case of emergency, in case the fire went out, in case someone got sick. Can you imagine the psychological weight of that? Being the one who has to stay awake while everyone else sleeps. Being responsible for keeping your family alive while you yourself are starving and exhausted. The historical record doesn't give us much insight into the emotional experience of these women, but I think about them a lot. The invisible labour of survival. There's this account. I wish I could find the original source, but it's referenced in multiple historical analyses of French peasants in the 1800s being visited by travellers during winter. The travellers would knock on doors and get no answer. When they finally pushed into the homes, they'd find entire families in their straw nests, barely conscious, emerging slowly like animals disturbed from hibernation. The travellers were shocked. They'd never seen anything like it. But for the peasants, this was just winter. This was normal. Now, let's shift north and east, because different regions developed different strategies that achieved similar goals. In Iceland, where winters were even harsher, but where they had a unique resource, the approach was different. Iceland sits on top of volcanic activity, which means geothermal hot springs everywhere. Medieval Icelanders, brilliant people, built their houses around these hot springs. They'd construct bathing pools fed by naturally hot water, and these pools would be indoors. The steam from the pools would heat the entire house. And here's where it gets interesting. Icelandic men would spend enormous portions of winter just sitting in these hot baths. Hours, sometimes most of the day. Historical accounts describe women bringing food to the men while they soaked, bringing visitors to conduct business. The men would literally live in the water, getting out only when absolutely necessary, because the hot water kept them warm without requiring food calories to generate body heat. It's a different form of the same logic. Reduce activity, reduce caloric needs, survive. Imagine that for a second. Your primary winter activity is sitting in a hot bath for 6 months. It sounds luxurious until you realize it's born from the same desperation as sleeping in a straw nest. You're not doing it for pleasure. You're doing it because the alternative is death. Russia had its own version. We talked earlier about the Russian pech, that massive masonry stove with the sleeping platform on top. Well, some families would essentially live on that platform during the deepest winter. The women would bring food up to the men and children. They'd descend only for necessities. The stove became their entire world. Warm stone beneath them, low ceiling above them, and nothing else mattered. The house would be freezing. They weren't wasting fuel heating unused space, but up on that platform, clustered together, they could survive. There's something almost prehistoric about this, isn't it? This regression to the most basic survival instincts. Humans curling up in warm places, minimizing movement, entering a state that's somewhere between living and just existing. We like to think of ourselves as sophisticated, advanced, but strip away our technology, our abundance, our climate control, and we revert to strategies that our cave-dwelling ancestors would recognize. Now here's the question nobody likes to ask, but we need to. What did this do to people psychologically? What happens to your mind when you spend months in a semi-conscious state, doing nothing, being nothing, just waiting for winter to end? We don't have detailed psychological profiles from medieval peasants, obviously, but we can extrapolate. Modern research on isolation, confinement, and sensory deprivation shows pretty clearly that humans need stimulation. We need activity, social interaction, purpose. When you remove all of that, mental health deteriorates. Depression becomes almost inevitable. Some people experience what psychologists call learned helplessness, a state where you become so passive, so convinced of your powerlessness, that you stop trying to improve your situation even when opportunities arise. I think medieval peasants who hibernated experienced something similar. When winter finally ended, when they emerged from their nests or their baths or their stove platforms, they weren't just physically weakened, they were mentally and emotionally depleted. The historical record mentions spring as a time of renewal and rebirth, and usually that's framed as poetic. But I think it was literal. People had to learn how to be fully human again after months of barely existing. And here's the really dark part. Not everyone woke up, especially the elderly, the very young, the already sick. You'd go to sleep in November, and someone in your family might not wake up in February. They'd just slip away during sleep. Hypothermia, malnutrition, disease, any of these could kill you while you were unconscious, and you might not even know it was happening until someone checked and realized you'd stopped breathing. Families would wake to death regularly, and there was no ceremony, no elaborate funeral during winter. You couldn't dig a grave in frozen ground, so bodies would be stored, usually outside in the cold, which preserved them, until spring when the ground thawed and proper burial was possible. Imagine living with that. Imagine your grandmother dying in January and her body is just there, outside, frozen, until April. The psychological trauma this must have caused, especially to children, is hard to even comprehend. But medieval people didn't have the luxury of processing trauma. They just had to survive the next day and the next and the next. Now, you might be wondering, did everyone do this? Was hibernation universal? And the answer is no. It was a strategy of last resort, employed by the poorest peasants in the harshest regions during the worst years. If you had enough food, you stayed active. If you lived in a milder climate, you found other ways to cope. But the fact that this strategy existed at all, that was documented and apparently common enough to warrant multiple historical references, tells you how desperate conditions could get. And it maps directly onto the medieval work calendar. Remember, agricultural work followed a strict seasonal pattern. Planting happened in spring. Growing and maintenance happened in summer. Harvest happened in autumn. And winter? Winter from Michaelmas, that's September 29th, until Candlemas, February 2nd. There was almost nothing to do. You couldn't plough frozen ground. You couldn't plant in snow. You couldn't harvest what didn't exist. Your obligations to your lord were minimal because even lords recognized there was no work to extract from frozen peasants. So winter became this strange liminal space, not quite living, not quite dying, just enduring. And hibernation, or semi-hibernation, or whatever you want to call this practice of aggressive rest, was one way to endure. There's a modern parallel here that I think is worth mentioning. Seasonal affective disorder, SAD appropriately. It's a type of depression that hits during winter months. Symptoms include excessive sleepiness, loss of interest in activities, social withdrawal, lethargy. Sound familiar? Now, we usually attribute SAD to lack of sunlight affecting brain chemistry, and that's true. But I wonder if there's also something deeper, something evolutionary. Maybe some part of our biology still remembers that winter is for sleeping, that winter is for minimizing, that winter is for just getting through. Modern people with SAD often describe feeling like they're hibernating. They sleep 12, 14, 16 hours a day. They withdraw from friends and activities. They eat simple, comforting foods. Not that different from endless pottage, really. They wait for spring, and when we treat SAD, we're basically fighting against this hibernation instinct. We use light therapy to trick the brain into thinking it's not winter. We encourage activity even when the body wants rest. We're overriding an ancient survival program. I'm not saying SAD is the same as medieval hibernation. The contexts are completely different. But maybe we're more connected to our ancestors than we realize. Maybe that pull towards sleep and stillness during dark months is an echo of a time when sleeping was the only way to survive. But here's what strikes me most about the hibernation accounts. The loneliness, the silence, the emptiness. Medieval people talked about winter as a kind of death. Not metaphorical death, but actual death of time itself. Nothing grew. Nothing happened. Days blurred together into one long, dark, cold existence where time stopped meaning anything. And in that silence, in that emptiness, people waited. They waited for the sun to return, for the ground to thaw, for life to be possible again. And the waiting itself became a kind of meditation, a forced mindfulness. When there's nothing to do, nowhere to go, no stimulation at all, you're alone with your thoughts in a way that modern people rarely experience. No phones, no books for most people. Literacy was limited and books were expensive. No music unless you made it yourself. Just your mind, your family's breathing, and the wind outside. What did they think about during those long months? Did they remember better times? Did they dream of spring? Did they pray? Did they tell stories to themselves? Or did they try not to think at all, knowing that thinking too much about their situation would drive them to despair? We'll never know. Those internal experiences died with them. But I imagine it was a mixture. Moments of peace, genuine rest after a hard year. Moments of connection, huddling with loved ones, feeling their warmth, and moments of crushing despair, hunger gnawing at you, cold seeping into your bones, wondering if this winter would be the last one you'd see. Survival isn't always heroic. Sometimes survival is just endurance, just making it through one more day, and then another, with no glory, no triumph, just the grim satisfaction of still being alive when spring finally arrives. And speaking of survival strategies, there was one ritual, one crucial event, that determined whether hibernation would even be possible. Because before you could sleep through winter, before you could reduce your activity and stretch your food stores, you needed protein, you needed fat, you needed a concentrated source of calories that would sustain you through months of semi-consciousness. And there was only one way most peasants could get that. November was slaughter month. It was the month when families made the hardest decision of the year, which animals would die so that humans could live. And the ritual of slaughter, the collective labour, the processing, the preservation, the emotions wrapped up in killing something you'd raised and cared for, that's a story of its own. A story of blood and pragmatism and the things we do when survival demands it. November arrives differently when you know what it means. For modern people, November's just another month. Maybe Thanksgiving if you're American, maybe just the slide into winter. But for medieval peasants, November meant blood, literally. It was the month when the pig you'd fed all year, the pig your children had named and played around, the pig that had become almost part of the family, that pig had to die. And everyone knew it. Everyone participated, because that pig was the difference between surviving winter and starving through it. Let me take you back to a specific moment, because I want you to feel the weight of this. It's early November, maybe 1320. You're a peasant with a family of 5. All year, you've been feeding your pig scraps, vegetable peelings, stale bread, anything that wasn't fit for human consumption. In October, you let the pig roam the forest where your lord permits it. The pig ate acorns, lots and lots of acorns. This is crucial, because acorns are incredibly fattening. A pig that spends October gorging on acorns can gain 30 to 50 pounds in a single month. That weight, that fat is what you need for winter. Fat is calories. Fat is flavour. Fat is survival. Now it's November, and the pig is as large as it's going to get. Maybe 200 pounds, maybe more if you've been lucky. And you've done the calculation in your head 100 times. If you keep feeding the pig through winter, you'll use resources that could feed your family. Pigs can't graze when there's snow. They can't forage when everything's frozen. They'd be eating your food. So the decision makes itself. The pig dies now, and the pig feeds you for months. But here's what the history books often skip. You don't do this alone. Pig slaughter was communal labour, a village event. Because processing a 200-pound pig by yourself is nearly impossible, and timing matters. The meat needs to be preserved quickly before it spoils. So you'd invite neighbours, relatives, anyone who could help. And in return you'd help them when their pig was slaughtered. It was a network of reciprocal obligations that held communities together. The actual slaughter was quick. It had to be. You'd restrain the pig, which was terrifying and difficult because pigs are strong and they sense what's coming. Someone experienced would slit the throat with a sharp knife. And here's where it gets very practical and very medieval. Someone else would be waiting with a bowl to catch the blood. Every drop. Because blood was food. Have you ever thought about how nothing was wasted in the medieval world? We throw away so much. Scraps go in the garbage. We buy exactly the cuts of meat we want and ignore the rest. But medieval people used everything, had to use everything. The pig's blood would be mixed with fat, grain and spices if you had any, then stuffed into the pig's own intestines to make blood sausage. Black pudding, the English called it. It sounds unappetizing to modern ears, but it was protein-rich food that could be eaten fresh or preserved. Poor people's food, yes, but essential food. The intestines themselves, once cleaned, became casings for other sausages. The organs, liver, heart, kidneys, would be cooked immediately and eaten fresh because they spoiled fastest. Nothing that could be eaten was discarded. The head would be boiled down for brawn, a kind of meat jelly. The feet would be pickled. The bones would be roasted and then boiled for marrow and to make broth. Even the fat around the organs, the leaf lard, would be rendered down and used for cooking all winter. Premium fat, that was. Better than the fat from other parts of the pig. And the skin? If you process it right, pig skin could be made into leather. Not the best leather, that came from cattle, but serviceable for patching shoes, making hinges for boxes, creating straps. Every single part of that animal had value, had purpose. The actual butchering was a skill. You had to know where to cut, how to separate muscle groups, which parts would cure well and which needed to be eaten fresh. Illuminated manuscripts, like the famous Très-Riche-Heure calendar we've mentioned, show November pages depicting this work. Peasants with knives, pigs hanging from beams, blood in basins. The illustrators didn't romanticize it. This was documentary art showing exactly what November meant. Death in service of life. The best cuts, the hams, the shoulders, the loins, these would be packed in salt. And I mean packed. You'd rub salt into every surface, then bury the meat in more salt. The salt would draw out moisture, create a hostile environment for bacteria, and if done correctly, preserve the meat for months. But salt was expensive. Really expensive. This was one of the biggest expenses of the year for a peasant family. You needed enough salt to preserve your pig, or the whole slaughter was pointless. The meat would rot within days. This is why salt shortages during the Great Famine were so devastating. It wasn't just that salt was hard to get. It was that without salt you couldn't preserve your pig, which meant your November slaughter, this crucial moment when you converted a living animal into winter survival, became meaningless. The meat would spoil. All that work, all that sacrifice, wasted, and your family would starve. After salting, meat would be hung in the smokehouse if you had one, or in the chimney space if you didn't. Smoke would slowly penetrate the meat over days or weeks, adding another layer of preservation and that distinctive smoky flavour. The result was hard, salty, intensely flavoured meat that bore little resemblance to fresh pork. But it was safe. It was edible. It was there when you needed it in February. Now let's talk about something that's uncomfortable but important. The emotional reality of killing an animal you've raised. Modern people mostly encounter meat as abstract objects wrapped in plastic. The connection between animal and food is severed by the time we see it. But medieval peasants raised their pigs, fed them daily, watched them grow. Children played near them. The pig was a presence in your life for a year. Not a pet. Medieval people weren't sentimental about livestock, but definitely a known entity, an individual. And then November came, and you killed that individual with your own hands. What does that do to you psychologically? How do you reconcile affection, or at least familiarity, with the act of slaughter? Medieval people developed what I'd call pragmatic detachment. They couldn't afford sentimentality about food animals. The pig's purpose was always to die and feed the family. Everyone understood that from the beginning. Children learned it early. This is the natural order. This is how we survive. Kindness to the pig while it lived, yes, but no illusions about its fate. Still, it couldn't have been easy, especially for children experiencing their first slaughter. Watching an animal they'd seen every day suddenly become meat, seeing blood, hearing the sounds, smelling the visceral reality of death. It was education in mortality, in the price of survival, in the fact that life feeds on life, and sometimes you're the one wielding the knife. There's no record of medieval people being traumatized by this. But absence of record isn't absence of experience. Maybe some children were upset. Maybe some adults found it harder than they let on. But showing weakness, expressing discomfort about necessary violence, that wasn't acceptable. You had to be hard, practical, capable. Your family's survival depended on it. And here's something interesting. The slaughter was often followed by a feast. Not a celebration exactly, but a communal meal. You'd cook some of the fresh meat, the parts that wouldn't keep anyway, and share it with the people who'd helped. It was payment in kind, but it was also a psychological release. After the violence of slaughter, after the hard work of butchering, you got to eat well. Really well. Fresh pork, maybe roasted, maybe in a rich stew. For one night, abundance. For one night, nobody was hungry. These feasts appear in the historical record because they were notable. They were the exception to the rule of scarcity, and they served an important social function. They reinforced community bonds. The people who helped you slaughter your pig would expect you to help them in return. These networks of obligation and reciprocity were how medieval villages functioned. Nobody could survive alone. You needed your neighbours, and they needed you. But imagine the inequity. A family wealthy enough to have 2 pigs could slaughter one and keep one for breeding or additional security. A family with no pig at all had no November slaughter, no preserved meat, no fat to cook with all winter. They'd have to rely on whatever scraps they could trade or beg for. The pig was a marker of relative prosperity. Having one meant you'd probably survive winter. Not having one meant you were in serious danger. And here's where the math gets cruel again. A 200-pound pig yields maybe 120 pounds of usable meat after you account for bones, organs eaten fresh, and blood used immediately. That sounds like a lot. It's not. Spread across 5 people over 4 months, November through February, that's about 6 pounds of meat per person per month. Half a pound per person per week. That's 1 meal of meat per week for each family member. The rest of the time, back to pottage, back to bread, back to whatever vegetables you'd stored. So the November pig wasn't abundance, it was supplementation. It was enough protein and fat to keep you functional through winter, but not enough to feast regularly. Every slice of that salted ham had to be rationed, calculated, preserved for when you needed it most. Usually late winter, when other food stores were running low and the hungry gap was approaching. Speaking of the hungry gap, and we're going to dive deep into this soon, the November slaughter was your insurance policy against it, because the absolute worst time for food scarcity wasn't December or January when you still had harvest supplies. It was March and April, when everything from last year was gone but nothing new was ready yet. That's when you'd break out the last of the preserved pork. That's when that pig you killed in November literally kept you alive. The calendar illustrations I mentioned, the ones showing November slaughter, they're paired with other months showing the full agricultural cycle. November is death, December is indoor rest, January is snow and cold. February is the beginning of hope, and then March. March is desperation. The art shows it. The historical records confirm it. Spring was when people died, not winter. Spring. But before we get there, I want you to sit with the reality of November for a moment. The reality of necessary violence. The reality of communal labour binding people together. The reality of children learning that survival sometimes requires hardness. The reality of trying to make one pig last 4 months for 5 people. The reality of calculations and ratios and every decision being about life or death. Medieval people didn't have the luxury of abstraction. They couldn't avoid the reality of where food came from. They couldn't outsource the difficult work to invisible others. They had to do it themselves, with their own hands, in their own homes, and that created a different relationship with food, with animals, with life and death itself. We're so disconnected now, most of us have never killed anything we've eaten, never had to make the choice between keeping a pig alive and feeding our family, never had to ration meat so carefully that a single slice feels precious, never participated in communal labour where your survival is literally in your neighbour's hands and theirs in yours. I'm not saying medieval life was better, it absolutely wasn't. But there's something to be learned from their directness, their unflinching acceptance of harsh realities, their understanding that survival is work, constant work, and that work often involves doing hard things without complaint because complaint changes nothing. The November pig died so the family could live. Simple as that. And the family honoured that sacrifice by wasting nothing, using everything, making that death count for as much as possible. But even with perfect preservation, even with careful rationing, even with the November pig to supplement your stores, winter was still a race against depletion. Every meal consumed brought you closer to having nothing. Every day that passed brought you closer to that terrifying moment when you looked at your remaining supplies and realized there wasn't enough, that you wouldn't make it to spring, that all your preparation, all your sacrifice, all your careful planning, it wasn't enough. That's the hungry gap. That's the spring starvation. That's the cruel paradox of medieval winter. The worst part wasn't when everything was frozen and dead. The worst part was when life was returning, but you had nothing left to sustain yourself until that life became food. When the ground was thawing but you'd already eaten your seed grain. When the birds were singing but you were too weak to work. When the world was waking up and you were fading away. And that cruel season, that gap between winter's end and harvest's beginning, that's where we see the true genius and desperation of medieval survival. That's when people ate things we can't imagine eating, foraged things that might poison them, made decisions that seem incomprehensible to us, because the alternative was watching your family die when salvation was just weeks away. Spring should be hopeful. That's what we think, isn't it? Winter ends, flowers bloom, birds return, the world comes back to life. But for medieval peasants, spring was often when they died. Not metaphorically, literally. More people starved to death in March and April than in the depths of January. And that paradox, dying while the world is being reborn around you, is one of the cruelest aspects of medieval survival. They called it the hungry gap. And once you understand what that term means, once you see the calendar mathematics that created it, you'll realize why spring was more feared than winter itself. Here's the timeline that trapped millions of people in a cycle of desperation. The harvest happened in August and September. That's when you gathered grain, stored vegetables, slaughtered animals for preservation. October was processing and preparation. November was the pig slaughter. By December, you'd settled into winter with your supplies carefully calculated. January and February, you rationed everything strictly. Cold, yes. Hungry, yes. But manageable if you'd prepared well and the harvest had been decent. Then March arrives, and you look at what's left in your storage, and the math becomes terrifying. You've got maybe 2 more weeks of grain, perhaps 1 salted ham remaining from the pig, a few withered turnips in the root cellar, some dried beans. That's it. That's all that stands between your family and starvation. And the next harvest? That's not until August, 5 months away. Even if you plant immediately, which you can't, because the ground is still partially frozen, even fast-growing vegetables won't be ready until late May or June. You're looking at 8 to 12 weeks with essentially no food. 8 to 12 weeks. That's the hungry gap. And here's the vicious cycle that made it even worse. Planting required enormous physical labor. You had to plow fields, often behind oxen or by hand if your oxen had died over winter. You had to break up soil, scatter seed, cover it, tend it. This required thousands of calories, but you didn't have thousands of calories. You were already weakened from months of insufficient food. So you were too weak to do the work that would eventually feed you. The people who most needed a good harvest were least capable of planting one. Some families made a desperate gamble. Eat better now to have strength for planting, and trust that somehow you'd make it to harvest. Others rationed even more severely. Saving food for after planting was done. Both strategies had massive risks. Eat too much now, you starve in June. Eat too little now, you can't plant effectively, and next year's harvest fails. There was no good answer. And here's something that should chill you. The church calendar conveniently placed Lent, the period of fasting and abstinence, right in the middle of the hungry gap. Lent runs from late February through early April, roughly 40 days leading up to Easter. During Lent, Christians were supposed to abstain from meat, dairy, eggs, and sometimes fish, depending on the interpretation and strictness. Now, officially, this was about spiritual discipline, about self-denial preparing the soul for Easter, but historians have noted the timing is awfully convenient. When you frame systematic starvation as religious devotion, you accomplish 2 things. You reduce food consumption when supplies are lowest, and you give people a narrative framework that makes suffering meaningful rather than just cruel. I'm not starving. I'm fasting for God. It's a psychological buffer against despair. Whether church authorities consciously designed Lent to manage the hungry gap, or whether it evolved organically from agricultural realities, that's debated. But the overlap is striking. So you've got inadequate food supplies, you're religiously prohibited from eating what little protein might be available, and your body is crying out for calories you don't have. What do? You forage. Desperately. And I mean desperately. We talked earlier about foraging during the November harvest failures, but spring foraging was different, more systematic, more dangerous. Because you weren't supplementing your diet, you were replacing it almost entirely with whatever you could find in nature. And spring, ironically, is both the best and worst time for this. Best because things are growing again. Plants are emerging from winter dormancy. Worst because those plants are young, small, and not yet ready to harvest. You're basically eating next month's food today, which creates another gap down the line. But when the alternative is death this week, you take what you can get. Nettles were a primary forage food. Stinging nettles, the plants that hurt to touch. They're actually incredibly nutritious, high in vitamins, minerals, protein for a plant, and they grow prolifically in early spring. People would harvest them wearing cloth wrapped around their hands, or sometimes just enduring the stings because gloves were a luxury. Then you'd boil the nettles, which neutralizes the sting, and eat them like spinach. Bitter, tough, not pleasant, but edible, sustaining. Dandelion greens. We think of dandelions as weeds now, and medieval people did too. But weeds are survivors. They grow where other things won't, and they grow early. Dandelion greens are more nutritious than lettuce. Medieval people would harvest the young leaves before the flower appeared. Again, bitter. But bitterness is just a flavour. Hunger makes everything taste acceptable. Wild garlic, ramps some places call them. They grow in forests in early spring and have an intensely pungent flavour. Medieval people would dig up the bulbs or harvest the leaves. The smell was overwhelming. If you ate wild garlic, everyone knew it. Your breath, your sweat, everything reeked of it for days. But it was food, and the strong flavour could make bland pottage almost palatable. Tree bark? Yes, really. Specifically the inner bark, the cambium layer between the outer bark and the wood. It's technically edible. People would strip bark from trees, carefully so as not to kill the tree completely, and boil the inner layer until it's softened. Then eat it. It has almost no nutrition, it's mostly fibre, but it fills your stomach. It gives you the sensation of eating, which psychologically helps even if physically it does almost nothing. Grass seeds. People would collect seeds from wild grasses, grind them into a kind of flour and make bread or add them to pottage. The yield was terrible. Hours of work for a handful of seeds. But again, when you're starving, you'll spend hours gathering anything edible. Roots. Any root you could identify as non-poisonous was fair game. People dug in partially frozen ground with their hands or sticks, searching for anything that might have calories. Sometimes you'd find edible roots. Sometimes you'd find roots that made you sick. Trial and error, often with deadly consequences. And here's where it gets really dark. People ate things they knew might kill them because the alternative was definitely dying from starvation. If you're going to die anyway, why not take the chance on the mushroom you're not quite sure about? Why not try that root even though you've heard it can cause illness? At least there's a possibility of survival. Poisoning death spiked in spring. Coroners' rolls, those legal documents investigating deaths, record people found dead with suspicious plants nearby. Were they suicides? Accidents? We'll never know for certain, but the timing tells us these were people desperate enough to gamble with toxic foods. Fungal poisoning, eating the wrong mushroom, ergot poisoning from contaminated grain, plant toxicity from things that looked edible but weren't. All of this increased dramatically during the Hungry Gap. And it wasn't just fatal poisonings. Many people got sick, which weakened them further, made them even less capable of working, created another downward spiral toward death. Crime also spiked in spring. Theft of food became endemic. People would steal from their neighbours' stores, even though they knew those neighbours were also starving. Break into barns looking for any missed grain. Poach from the lord's lands, knowing the punishment if caught could be brutal. But what's the point of avoiding punishment if you're going to starve anyway? Might as well risk it. Historical records show conflict between neighbours intensifying during March and April. Accusations of theft, fights over foraging rights, disputes about who could collect deadfall from which section of forest, the social bonds that held communities together, the reciprocal obligations, the mutual aid, all of that strained under the pressure of scarcity. When everyone is starving, solidarity becomes difficult. Survival instinct overrides community ethics. But, and this is important, it didn't completely collapse. Most communities held together. Most people helped each other even when they had almost nothing to give. Medieval people understood that long-term survival required cooperation. If you steal from your neighbor today and they starve, next year when you need help, there's no one to help you. So even in extreme deprivation, there was sharing. Minimal sharing, calculated sharing, but sharing nonetheless. There are accounts of wealthier peasants, those who'd managed to hoard a bit extra, distributing small amounts of food to those worst off. Not from generosity necessarily, but from pragmatism. If half your village dies, who's going to help you with harvest? Who's going to contribute to communal labour? Keeping people alive, even just barely, was an investment in future productivity. Churches and monasteries also provided some relief. Not enough, never enough, but something. Monasteries would open their stores and distribute bread or thin soup to the desperate. This was partly charity, partly political. Keep people alive and they stay faithful. Let them starve, and they might turn to heresy or rebellion or just despair. The church had practical reasons to keep peasants alive enough to work and pay tithes. But even with all these strategies, foraging, theft, sharing, church charity, people died, especially the vulnerable. The elderly, who couldn't forage or work and therefore got the smallest rations. The very young, whose bodies couldn't tolerate the nutritional deficiencies. The already sick or injured, who had no reserves to draw on. Pregnant women, who needed extra nutrition but got less because they couldn't work as hard. Spring was when you'd wake up and find someone in your village had died during the night. Usually the old ones, quietly, no drama, just gone. And you'd register it with that pragmatic detachment we talked about earlier. Another death. Another body to store until the ground thawed enough for burial. Because yes, even in March and April, the ground could still be partially frozen. You might have to wait weeks to bury the dead. Life and death in medieval spring was a prolonged horror of waiting. Waiting for the ground to thaw, waiting for plants to grow, waiting for your strength to return, waiting to see if you'd make it. And the psychological toll. God, the psychological toll. Imagine watching spring arrive, watching the world turn green and alive and beautiful, hearing birds sing, feeling warmth return to the air, and you're dying. Your children are crying from hunger. Your body is consuming itself, muscle wasting away, your ribs visible, your face hollow. The world is celebrating renewal while you're experiencing destruction. The disconnect must have been agonizing. Some people gave up. Just gave up. Stopped trying to forage. Stopped rationing. Stopped caring. Historians call this wasting syndrome, or giving up eaters, though those terms are modern. Medieval records just note that some people seem to die without clear cause. Not disease, not injury, just death. And it makes you wonder if it was the psychological breaking point, if the gap between the world's renewal and your body's decay was too much to bear. But most people didn't give up. They pushed through, day after day, week after week, somehow finding the will to survive, to take one more step into the forest looking for nettles, to dig one more time in the cold ground hoping for a root, to share their last crust of bread with a child even though they were starving too. Because spring meant summer was coming. Summer meant harvest. Harvest meant survival. You just had to last a little longer. Just a little longer. And some years, just barely, people made it. May would arrive and the first early vegetables would be ready. Radishes, maybe. Fast-growing greens. Not enough to end hunger, but enough to hope. June brought more. July, even more. And by August the harvest would come, and you'd have survived another year. Another cycle. Another test. Have you ever been truly hungry? Not skipped lunch hungry. Not dieting hungry. But starving hungry? where your body is eating itself and you can feel it, where every thought is about food, where you do almost anything, compromise your values, hurt others, risk death, just to feel full again. Most of us haven't. We've been fortunate enough to never face that test. Medieval peasants faced it every single spring, and most of them passed that test not through heroism, but through grim, grinding endurance. The Hungry Gap taught medieval people something we've forgotten, that survival sometimes means accepting suffering without the promise of relief, that you can't always fix problems, sometimes you can just outlast them, that hope is a luxury, but endurance is a necessity. And that the cruelest moments in life often come when you can see salvation, can see the green shoots growing, can feel the warm air promising summer, but can't quite reach it yet. Spring starvation was medieval life's final examination each year, and the pass-fail was literal. You either made it to harvest, or you didn't. Your body either had enough reserves to sustain you through the gap, or it didn't. Your community either held together well enough to support its weakest members, or it didn't. There was no partial credit, no second chances, just survival or death. But here's what's remarkable. Between the suffering of spring and the uncertainty of survival, medieval people still found moments of joy, still created celebration, still carved out times when they pushed back against the darkness and declared, against all evidence, that life was worth living. Because humans are strange like that. We need hope. We need community. We need something to look forward to, even when, especially when, everything seems hopeless. And that's what winter festivals provided. That's what Christmas meant in this context. Not the commercial holiday we know, but a desperate, defiant celebration in the middle of the darkest season. A moment when people said, we're still here. We're still human. We're still capable of joy. And those 12 days of Christmas, those brief, precious days of rest and feasting and community, they weren't a luxury. They were survival equipment for the soul. Darkness needs interruption. That's not poetry, it's survival psychology. When everything is cold and hard and desperate, when every day is the same struggle, when hope feels like a luxury you can't afford, that's when you need to stop, to gather, to celebrate something, anything, even if the reasons feel hollow. Medieval people understood this instinctively, which is why, right in the middle of winter's worst grip, they created their longest holiday of the year. 12 days when work stopped, when fires burned brighter, when people pretended, or maybe truly believed, that joy was possible even in the depths of December. Christmas wasn't one day, not in medieval Europe. It was 12 full days stretching from Christmas Eve on December 24th, all the way to Epiphany on January 6th. 12 days when nobody worked. Not in the fields, obviously. There was no field work in December anyway. But no repairs, no maintenance, no obligations to the Lord beyond what was absolutely necessary. For once, time was your own. For once, you could rest without guilt. For once, survival took a back seat to something resembling living. And here's what's beautiful about this. It was mandatory. The Lord couldn't demand work during the 12 days of Christmas. Church law and social custom protected this time. It was a rare inversion of power, the powerless getting to say no, getting to claim space and time that was usually controlled by others. Whether you were starving or comfortable, whether you had fuel or were freezing, whether you'd had a good harvest or a terrible one, Christmas still happened. The calendar demanded it. Now let's be clear, peasant Christmas wasn't the commercial extravaganza we experience today. No shopping, no expensive gifts, no elaborate decorations from stores. But it was decoration nonetheless. People brought the outside in, holly, ivy, bay, whatever evergreen plants they could gather. Why? Because green meant life. In the middle of winter, when everything looked dead, when the landscape was brown and grey and white, having something green in your home was a radical statement. Life persists, growth continues, winter doesn't win. There's this quote from a 12th century description of London that I love. Every man's house, as also their parish churches, was decked with holly, ivy, bay, and whatsoever the season of the year afforded to be green. Think about that phrasing, whatsoever the season afforded. They weren't being choosy. They were taking whatever nature gave them and declaring it beautiful. It's almost defiant, isn't it? You've taken a harvest, winter, but you can't take our ability to find beauty. The centerpiece of Christmas, though, was food. And this is where the class divide becomes painfully visible. Lords held feasts, massive, extravagant displays of wealth, roasted meats, multiple courses, wine flowing freely, entertainment. These feasts were partly celebration, partly propaganda. The Lord showing his peasants, see, I can provide. I have abundance. Your loyalty to me is justified. And sometimes, peasants got to participate. There was this tradition in some manors where the Lord would invite a few of his villains, his tied peasants, to dine in the great hall for the Christmas meal. Imagine being selected for this. You've spent all year eating pottage and dark bread. Your children have never tasted proper meat except maybe once after the pig slaughter. And suddenly you're in the Lord's hall at his table, eating food you've only heard about. There's this specific tradition that appears in multiple historical records. The Lord would select a lucky peasant and allow him to bring 2 friends. They could eat and drink as much as they wanted, anything they wanted, for the duration of 2 burning candles. That's the time limit. 2 candles burned one after another, maybe 2 hours total. In that time, you could eat like the wealthy ate. You could gorge yourself on roasted meat, on white bread made from wheat flour, on cheese and butter, and things that existed in your imagination but rarely in your reality. Can you imagine the psychological complexity of that experience? The joy of abundance mixed with the bitterness of knowing it's temporary? The humiliation of being selected like a pet who performs tricks for treats, mixed with genuine gratitude for a full stomach? Medieval peasants weren't naive. They understood the power dynamics at play, but they also understood that pride doesn't fill your belly. So you accepted the invitation, you ate as much as you could, and you brought home whatever you could carry. Because that was another tradition. Peasants were allowed to carry away as much as they could hold in their clothes. You'd stuff bread into your tunic, wrap meat in your cloak, fill every pocket and fold of fabric with food. It must have looked absurd, people waddling out of the hall bulging with stolen treasures. But that food might feed your family for a week, might make the difference between just surviving and surviving with a little comfort. So you took it all, every scrap. No shame. For most peasants who weren't invited to the Lord's Hall, Christmas still meant eating better than usual. You'd break into your preserved stores more generously. Remember that salted ham from the November pig? Christmas was when you'd cut a proper portion. Not the thin slices you rationed the rest of winter, a real piece of meat. You'd cook it into your pottage, and for 1 meal, maybe 2, your dinner would taste rich, would taste like feast food, even if it was still just stew. Some families saved a chicken for Christmas. All year, this chicken laid eggs, valuable protein. But at Christmas, the chicken itself became the meal, roasted if you were fortunate enough to have an oven or spit. more likely boiled in that eternal pot. Either way, it was meat, it was flavour, it was abundance by peasant standards, and ale. Christmas meant drinking. Ale was consumed year-round, it was safer than water, and the alcohol content was low enough that you weren't drunk constantly. But Christmas ale was special. Brewed stronger, maybe flavoured with spices if you could afford them. Drinking wasn't just about intoxication, though that certainly happened. It was about warmth spreading through your body, about relaxation, about the brief illusion that everything was okay. But here's the catch that I need to mention. Christmas wasn't free. Peasants still had obligations. Many were required to pay extra rent to the Lord's table during Christmas, usually in the form of eggs, hens, bread. You were celebrating, yes, but you were also funding the Lord's celebration. The hierarchy didn't dissolve during Christmas, it just became slightly more bearable. Slightly more reciprocal. The Lord fed you once, you fed him all year. The math was never in your favour, but at least during Christmas there was some gesture of mutual obligation. Now let's talk about what people actually did during those 12 days, because it wasn't all eating and drinking. There was play. Real, actual play. And this might surprise you because we think of medieval life as being so grim and serious. But humans need play. We need laughter and silliness and moments of forgetting our burdens. Medieval people were no different. Snowball fights are documented in illuminated manuscripts from the late 14th and 15th centuries. There's this famous image from the Hours of Adelaide of Savoy, Duchess of Burgundy, painted around 1460, showing a snowball fight in a city. Adults and children throwing snowballs at each other. And here's what's hilarious. Nobody in the illustration is wearing weather-appropriate clothing. They're dressed like it's a mild spring day, which tells you this was artistic idealization, not documentary realism. But it also tells you that snowball fights were common enough to be worth painting, common enough to be recognized as a winter activity. Think about what a snowball fight represents in the context of everything we've discussed. It's play using the very element, snow, that makes your life harder. It's taking the cold that threatens you and transforming it into joy. That's not just recreation, that's resistance. That's refusing to let winter have complete power over your emotions. Ice skating was another winter activity, especially in Scandinavia and northern regions where water froze reliably. The earliest skates were made from bone, polished horse shin bones or other large animal bones tied to shoes with leather straps. You'd push yourself along with a stick. It wasn't elegant figure skating. It was transportation and entertainment combined, a way to cross frozen rivers and ponds while having fun doing it. In Western Europe, ice skating spread more slowly. There are references to it in England from the 12th century, but it remained relatively rare compared to Scandinavia where it was ubiquitous. Climate matters, obviously. You can't skate on ice that doesn't reliably freeze. But also culture matters. Scandinavians grew up on ice. They were comfortable with it. Western Europeans were more cautious, more fearful of the cold. Sledding happened too, though it's less documented. Children, and probably adults, would slide down snowy hills on whatever they could find. Pieces of wood, animal hides, improvised sleds made from scraps. This wasn't organised recreation with rules and equipment. This was making do, finding joy in whatever was available. And then there was indoor entertainment, storytelling, music, if someone had an instrument and the skill to play it. Simple games, dice mostly, though gambling was technically forbidden by the church. But rules relaxed during Christmas. Singing. Carols weren't yet the polished hymns we know, but simple songs, often bawdy, often funny. Entertainment that required nothing but voices and imagination. This is something we've lost, I think. We need so much stuff to entertain ourselves now. Screens, streaming services, elaborate equipment for hobbies. Medieval people entertained themselves with literally nothing but their own creativity and community. Was it as stimulating as binge-watching Netflix? Probably not. But it was genuine connection, actual human interaction, something we claim to value but often avoid. There's also the psychological function of having a shared cultural experience. Everyone celebrated Christmas, rich and poor, young and old. The content of the celebration varied wildly, the Lord's feast versus the peasant's humble meal, but the timing was universal. You were participating in something larger than your individual suffering. You were part of a civilization, a culture, a community that said, "This time is special." We stop together. We celebrate together. Even if we're not equal, we're at least synchronized. And maybe that's what festivals fundamentally provide: synchronization. A collective pause where everyone agrees to step out of normal time and into something different. When your life is grinding labor and constant uncertainty, having these fixed points of celebration gives structure, gives something to look forward to. 3 months until Christmas, 2 months, 1 month, it's coming. Hold on. Children especially needed this. Imagine being a medieval child. Your entire life is work and cold and hunger and watching adults struggle. Christmas was when adults smiled more, when food tasted better, when there might be play instead of just labor, when the world felt a little less hostile. Children don't understand harvest failures or seed ratios or feudal obligations, but they understand that Christmas means something good, something different, and that hope, that small bright spot in darkness, might be what keeps them going. There's no hard data on this, but I believe Christmas functioned as a kind of cultural antidepressant, a scheduled intervention against the despair that chronic hardship creates. You can endure a lot if you know there's a break coming, if you know that for 12 days the rules relax and life gets slightly better. It's like the psychological principle behind weekends. Knowing rest is coming makes work bearable. Medieval people had their own version of that, and it centered on Christmas. But Christmas ended. Epiphany came, January 6th, the celebration of the 3 wise men visiting baby Jesus, and that was it. Back to normal, back to rationing, back to cold and hunger and waiting for spring. The decorations came down, the ale ran out, the leftover food was carefully stored, and you were left with memories of 12 days of relative joy and the knowledge that it would be another year before it happened again. Did that make the return to hardship easier or harder? I honestly don't know. Maybe both. Easier because you'd had a break. Your spirits were lifted. You remembered that life could be good. Harder because the contrast made the everyday grind seem even grimmer. Like tasting sugar makes bland food taste blander. But medieval people didn't have the option to just stay in perpetual celebration. They had to return to survival mode, had to ration again, work again, endure again, and they did. Generation after generation, century after century, they survived winters that would destroy most of us. They endured hunger we can't imagine. They made it through cold that would hospitalize modern people, not because they were superhuman, not because they didn't suffer, but because they had no choice, and because they developed strategies, physical, social, psychological, that worked just well enough, just often enough, to perpetuate their communities. Which brings us to the real question. The question we've been circling this entire time. What can we, modern, comfortable, technologically advanced people, learn from medieval peasants who survived winter after winter after winter of desperate hardship? What wisdom did they possess that we've forgotten? What strategies did they employ that might actually be relevant to our own lives? our own challenges, our own moments of darkness. Because this story isn't just history. It's a manual, a guide, a collection of lessons written in suffering and survival that we'd be foolish to ignore. So what do we take from all of this? What do medieval peasants, people who died 700 years ago, people who lived lives so different from ours they might as well be aliens, what do they have to teach us? More than you might think. Because underneath all the specific details, the pottage and the pig slaughtering and the straw-stuffed shoes, there are principles, universal truths about survival, about resilience, about what it means to be human when everything is hard. And some of those truths, we desperately need them right now. Let's start with the most uncomfortable lesson. Fragility is the default state of everything. Medieval people lived this reality every single day. Their entire survival system operated on razor-thin margins. One bad harvest away from starvation, one harsh winter away from disaster. They built their lives knowing that collapse was always possible, always close. And here's what's striking. We've somehow convinced ourselves we're different, that our systems are robust, that we're insulated from the kind of catastrophic failures they experienced. But are we? The pandemic showed us how quickly supply chains break, how fast grocery stores empty, how fragile our just-in-time everything really is. Climate change is showing us that weather patterns we've depended on for centuries are shifting. Economic instability reminds us that the structures we think are solid are actually incredibly precarious. We're not as different from medieval peasants as we think. We've just gotten better at hiding the fragility behind complexity. Medieval people didn't hide from fragility. They accepted it, planned for it, built their entire culture around managing it. They knew the system could fail, so they created backup systems, community networks, preservation techniques, multiple strategies running simultaneously. They never put all their eggs in one basket because they understood intimately that baskets break. What if we adopted that mindset? What if instead of optimizing everything for maximum efficiency, we built in redundancy, buffer, slack? What if we accepted that collapse is possible and prepared for it, rather than pretending it can't happen to us? That's not pessimism. That's wisdom. Here's the second lesson, and it's going to sound strange. Monotony is underrated. We're obsessed with variety, novelty, constant stimulation. We get bored if we eat the same lunch 2 days in a row. We need new shows, new content, new experiences constantly. And we frame this as sophistication. We're evolved beyond simple pleasures, right? But medieval people understood something we've forgotten. Reliability beats variety when survival is on the line. That eternal pot of pottage? Boring as hell. But it worked. It kept people alive for months. It was simple. It was predictable. And that predictability was its strength. When you don't have to think about what's for dinner, when you don't have to make constant decisions about food, you free up mental energy for other things, for social connection, for problem solving, for rest. Modern life drowns us in choices. Analysis paralysis is real. Decision fatigue is real. We're exhausted by abundance, which sounds absurd, but it's true. Medieval people didn't have that problem. They had routine. They had monotony. And sometimes, maybe often, that's exactly what we need too. Not as deprivation, but as intentional simplification, as a way to reclaim energy being wasted on trivial decisions. What would it look like to embrace productive monotony? To eat simpler, repeated meals during busy weeks? To wear a uniform of sorts so you don't waste mental energy on clothing choices? To establish routines that don't require constant decision-making? Medieval people would recognize this instantly. They'd call it survival. We might call it life optimization. Same principle. Third lesson, your body is smarter than you think. Medieval people trusted their bodies in ways we don't anymore. They understood that when you're cold, you need to move. When you're hot, you need to remove layers. When you're exhausted, you need to sleep. Not push through with caffeine and willpower, but actually sleep. They listened to physical signals because ignoring those signals meant death. We've divorced ourselves from our bodies. We sit all day despite our bodies screaming for movement. We stay awake despite exhaustion because we have screens and artificial light. We eat despite not being hungry because it's dinner time. We override our body's wisdom constantly, treating physical signals as inconveniences rather than information. Medieval people wore layers and adjusted them based on activity level. That's not just clothing strategy. That's listening to your body's feedback loop. Too hot? Remove a layer. Too cold? Add one. Simple. Responsive. We could do the same with our modern challenges. Tired? Sleep. Hungry? Eat. Not hungry? Don't eat just because it's a scheduled mealtime. Trust the system that evolved over millions of years instead of the arbitrary routines we've created. Fourth lesson, and this one's crucial. Community is infrastructure. Medieval peasants survived because they helped each other. The pig slaughter was communal. The harvest was communal. Childcare, elder care, tool sharing, knowledge sharing, all communal. They didn't have social safety nets provided by governments. They had each other. And those networks of reciprocal obligation were the difference between surviving and dying. We've replaced community with institutions and services. Need food? DoorDash. Need help? Call a professional. Need social interaction? Social media. And yes, these things are convenient, but they're also fragile. They depend on infrastructure, electricity, internet, functioning economy. Medieval communities didn't depend on any of that. They just depended on the agreement that we help each other because someday we'll need help too. What would it mean to rebuild actual community? Not just friendly neighbours, but functional networks of mutual aid. People you could call at 2 a.m. if there was an emergency. People who'd bring you food if you were sick. People you'd do the same for without expecting immediate repayment, because you trust the network will balance out over time. Medieval people had this by necessity. We've lost it by convenience. But maybe convenience isn't worth what we've traded for it. Fifth lesson. Doing less can be doing enough. This is the hibernation lesson, and it's uncomfortable. We're taught that productivity is virtue, that doing more is always better, that if you're not grinding, you're failing. Medieval people who semi-hibernated through winter would laugh at this, or cry. They understood that sometimes the best strategy is radical rest. Doing the absolute minimum to survive so you have energy for when it matters. You can't operate at maximum capacity all the time. You break, you burn out, your body fails. Medieval peasants who tried to stay active all winter died because they burned through resources, both food and physical reserves, that they needed for spring planting. The smart ones slept, rested, conserved, and then, when spring came, they had the energy to work, to survive. We need this lesson desperately. We need permission to do less, to rest without guilt, to acknowledge that some seasons are for maximum effort and other seasons are for minimal survival, and both are valid. Not every quarter needs to be your best quarter. Not every week needs to be productive. Sometimes you need to hunker down, do the bare minimum, and just make it through. That's not failure. That's strategy. Sixth lesson. Waste nothing, including suffering. Medieval people used every part of the pig, every scrap of food, every minute of daylight. Nothing was wasted because waste meant death. But they also didn't waste their suffering. They transformed it into lessons, into strategies, into cultural knowledge that got passed down. Their pain became wisdom that kept future generations alive. What if we approached our own difficulties this way? Not just enduring them, but extracting value from them. What did this teach me? How am I stronger now? What can I share that might help someone else? Medieval suffering wasn't optional, but they made it meaningful by ensuring it contributed to survival, theirs and their communities. We have the luxury of avoiding a lot of suffering, and we should use that luxury. I'm not romanticizing hardship. But when suffering comes anyway, as it inevitably does, we can choose whether it's just pain or whether it becomes growth, whether it's wasted or transformed. Medieval people didn't have that choice about whether suffering happened. They only chose what to do with it. Maybe we can learn from that. 7th lesson. Joy is not a luxury, it's survival equipment. This is the Christmas lesson. Medieval people were starving, freezing, dying, and they still carved out 12 days for celebration, for play, for feasting as much as they could manage. Because they understood something we pretend not to know. You can't survive on grim determination alone. You need hope. You need moments of lightness. You need to remember why survival matters. We treat joy as something you earn through productivity. Finish your work, then you can relax. Hit your goals, then you can celebrate. But medieval people didn't wait for conditions to be perfect. Conditions were never perfect. They celebrated anyway. They played in the snow despite being cold and hungry. They decorated with holly despite having no money. They found joy in terrible circumstances because joy wasn't a reward, it was fuel. What if we stopped postponing joy until everything is handled? What if we celebrated small things now? What if we played despite being tired, connected despite being busy, laughed despite difficulties? Not as distraction from problems, but as the very thing that gives us strength to face problems. Medieval people knew this. Maybe we should remember it. 8th lesson. Endurance is its own kind of heroism. We love dramatic stories. Brave heroes overcoming impossible odds through courage and strength. But medieval winter survival wasn't dramatic. It was grinding, day after day of just getting through. No climax, no resolution, just endurance. And that endurance, that unglamorous, undramatic persistence, that's what actually kept people alive. Most of life is like this, isn't it? Not dramatic struggles, but long, slow challenges. Chronic illness, financial stress, relationship difficulties, caring for aging parents, raising children, building a career. These aren't solved in one heroic moment. They're endured through countless small decisions to keep going, to get up again, to try one more time. That's the real heroism. The kind nobody makes movies about because it's not exciting. But it's real, and medieval people exemplified it. You don't have to be a hero. You just have to endure. Just have to survive today, and then tomorrow, and then the day after that. And if you string enough of those days together, eventually you'll look back and realize you survived something that felt impossible. You'll realize you are strong in ways that don't fit heroic narratives, but that are strong nonetheless. And finally, the last lesson. Gratitude isn't optional. Medieval people who survived winter didn't take it for granted. Spring wasn't just a season, it was a miracle. Every person who made it through was grateful in ways we can barely understand. Grateful for warmth, for food, for life itself. Not because they were more virtuous than us, but because they knew how close they'd come to losing everything. We have central heating, grocery stores, medicine, safety nets, the survival challenges we face, and they're real. I'm not minimizing modern struggles, but they're different. Most of us won't die from cold this winter, won't starve, won't watch our children wither from malnutrition, and that's worth acknowledging, worth feeling grateful for. Not in a toxic positivity way that dismisses real problems, but in an honest recognition that we've inherited incredible gift from centuries of human progress. When you turn on your heat tonight, remember the medieval peasants stuffing straw in their shoes. When you eat your next meal, remember the eternal pot of pottage eaten 3 times a day for 4 months. When you complain about being bored, remember people who hibernated through winter because there was nothing else to do. Not to make yourself feel guilty, but to cultivate genuine appreciation for what you have. Because gratitude isn't just nice, it's psychologically protective, it's resilience fuel. Medieval people who stayed grateful stayed sane. Same applies to us, so here we are. We've spent the last couple of hours travelling through medieval winter, through hunger and cold and desperate survival, through pig slaughter and hibernation and spring starvation, through Christmas joy and community bonds and the grinding reality of endurance. And what we've discovered is that medieval peasants weren't primitive people fumbling through darkness. They were sophisticated survivors who developed complex strategies for managing impossible circumstances. They were our ancestors, and their wisdom runs in our veins whether we acknowledge it or not. You and I were incredibly lucky. We were born into a time of abundance that medieval people couldn't even imagine. But abundance creates its own challenges. We've forgotten how to be resilient because we haven't had to practice. We've forgotten how to endure because we've been able to fix or avoid most problems. We've forgotten how to accept fragility because we've built systems that hide it from us. But the world is changing. Climate is shifting. Systems are straining. The challenges our grandchildren will face might look more like medieval winters than we'd like to admit. Which means the lessons from those winters, the real, practical, psychological lessons about survival, those aren't just historical curiosities, they're inheritance, they're preparation, they're wisdom we might desperately need. I hope you found something valuable in this journey. Maybe it's just interesting history. Maybe it's deeper than that. Maybe you'll think about medieval winters next time you turn on your heat, next time you open a fully stocked refrigerator, next time you feel grateful for the simple fact of being warm, fed and safe. Or maybe you'll think about them next time you're struggling, next time you're enduring something hard, and you'll remember that humans have survived worse. That endurance is enough, that you're stronger than you think. As you drift off to sleep tonight, warm and comfortable, I want you to send a little thought backward through time. To all those peasants who survived winters we can barely imagine, who endured and adapted and found joy in terrible circumstances, who passed down not just their genes but their wisdom, their resilience, their understanding that life is hard and beautiful and worth fighting for, even when, especially when, everything seems impossible. You're their descendant, their heir, and somewhere in your DNA, in your cellular memory, their strength lives on. You can access it when you need it. You can draw on centuries of human survival and say, if they made it through medieval winters with nothing but wool and straw and community and will, if they endured all that, then I can handle what's in front of me. I have their strength, their wisdom, their refusal to give up even when giving up would be so much easier. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, for listening to these stories, for sitting with the discomfort and the cold and the hunger and the small moments of joy that made it bearable. I know this was heavy at times, dark at times, but I hope it was also illuminating. I hope you found something here that resonates, something that helps, something that reminds you that you're part of a long line of survivors and survival is written into your bones. There are so many more stories waiting to be told, so many corners of history that hold wisdom we've forgotten. So many ancestors who have lessons for us if we're willing to listen. I can't wait to share more of them with you, to take you on more journeys into the past that somehow illuminate the present, to keep exploring what it means to be human across centuries and circumstances. So rest now. Let these stories settle